The story kicks off in a frozen wasteland teeming with monsters like a giant white serpent that snacks on glaciers, a gray bear that makes the ground tremble, and a disgusting rat that poisons the seas. However, an emperor who actually survived that icy hell once said the real threat wasn't the monsters at all. Deeper into this wasteland, a barbarian woman crushes a huge bug under her foot, setting off a small explosion. Nearby, a barbarian fella grabs a bug with his bare hands and just rips it in two without breaking a sweat. Another man walks forward at a slow pace and all the bugs scatter in absolute terror. It's pretty obvious why. They're instantly shredded to pieces as he moves right through them. He looks over at the guy who tore the bug apart and remarks that only a barbarian would wear his ignorance like a medal. He then asks just how much longer he's supposed to put up with being around such simple-minded brutes. The woman just responds by asking what ignorant means and wonders if it's something they can eat. He lets out a sigh and mutters that it's not even worth explaining, as they start to roast the bugs they just killed. He reminds them that he specifically told them not to eat those, warning them that the bugs are deadly poisonous. You can see the realization hit them as he glares. He comments that it's been less than a week, and they've already eaten their entire food supply. The woman tries to defend what they did, saying it was the noblest of challenges. He asks why she's so proud of being reckless right as the bald guy starts foaming at the mouth. Turns out the bald guy's name is Greta. The woman is completely shocked when he collapses and starts yelling at him to get it together. The supposed smart one just watches her panic. And when she starts slapping Greta over and over to try and wake him up, he just turns away and stares out into the snow. He thinks to himself that this is not what he wanted at all. Back in his world, a place without any magic or wonder, he had quit his job to go on an adventure. He says he climbed the tallest mountain on Earth, traveled to the planet's very core, and even journeyed to the southernmost tip of the world. But nothing ever changed. There was no magic, no great discovery. Reality was just plain boring every single night. He wished that he would wake up inside of a dream, and one day that prayer was finally answered. Meanwhile, somewhere else, a carriage is slowly making its way through the snow. One man complains about how cold it is, and his boss tells him to bundle up unless he wants to freeze solid. The mercenaries are grumbling that even for a big reward, this whole trip is just pure insanity. One of them mutters that only a complete lunatic would try to cross the White Wasteland. Their captain tells them to quiet down, reminding them they all agreed to the job. They argue back that none of them ever imagined it would be this miserable. Inside the carriage, a butler clicks his tongue in annoyance. He clears his throat and asks the lady in the carriage if she's holding up okay. She replies with a gentle smile, saying that she is. Her name is Milena from the Akasha family. Outside, the mercenaries are still complaining about the freezing weather. The butler scolds them for being so rude, but Milena tells him not to be so harsh. She reminds him that these men are the ones escorting them through this dangerous wasteland and suggests they invite them inside since they look like they're about to turn into icicles. The butler firmly refuses, insisting that she of all people knows what kind of things lurk in these frozen lands. Milena nods and begins to explain that a long time ago, an emperor tried to conquer the entire world, and that included the White Wasteland. She tells the story of how he led legions of soldiers into the snow and even went in there himself. But as the years passed, the empire fell to ruin, and the emperor limped back all by himself, looking ancient, and with his spirit completely shattered. He rambled like a man who'd lost his mind, warning them about monsters, but insisting the real threat wasn't even the beasts. It was the barbarians who were apparently thriving out there in the White Void. The butler just dismisses it as an old legend, but Milena points out the emperor's words had some truth to them, especially since a whole bunch of the monsters he described were later proven to be real. The butler just laughs it off, though. He notes that for all the stories, not a single person has ever actually seen a barbarian. Milena has to agree that despite all the tales, there have been 0 confirmed sightings. All of a sudden, the captain yells for everyone to halt, saying he spotted something up ahead. A mercenary asks what he sees, and they all squint through the heavy snow, barely making out a shadowy figure. When the captain finally gets a good look, he says he has some good news and some bad news. When they press him, he says the good news is that the figure is small. The bad news, it's heading straight for them. The whole group tenses up as the captain starts to panic, his hand flying to his sword. But then they realize it's a person. As the figure gets closer, they can see white hair and that he's hardly wearing any clothes. That's when it dawns on them. They're staring at a barbarian. The man glances their way and says he was getting bored of only seeing other barbarians. So he figured he'd take a walk, and stumbling upon outsiders was a real stroke of luck. He smiles and adds that he didn't expect to run into anyone out in this wasteland. He introduces himself as Kettle, an Ashen barbarian, and after looking them over, asks if they're merchants. When they say yes, he just assumes they must be the hired guards. The captain confirms it, and Kettle suggests they should probably just turn around. He adds that he doubts they'll listen, though. The captain immediately stiffens, and Kettle realizes there must be someone inside the carriage. Inside, Milena is sitting nervously. That's when Kettle casually offers to work for them. Everyone is completely stunned by his offer. He asks if he was being unclear, then explains he's offering to guide them through the wasteland. The captain stammers, asking if a legendary barbarian seriously wants to be a mercenary, and if that's all he's really after. He's basically asking if Kettle is planning to cause trouble. Kettle just replies that if he wanted to hurt them, they would have been dead a long time ago. The captain knocks on the carriage and asks Milena if she heard all that. She confirms she did. The butler, totally confused, asks what's going on. The captain explains that the barbarian wants to join their crew and then asks Milena to make the call. She thinks about it for a second, then asks if they could even beat him in a fight. The captain says he wouldn't even dream of trying. He can tell Kettle is a complete monster in a man's body. Milena hesitates for a moment, but finally gives the okay, telling them to accept his offer. The captain relays the news to Kettle, who beams and says that's great to hear. But even so, the guards are still on edge. The mercenaries watch him like a hawk as he approaches. The captain asks him where he thinks he's going, and Kettle just tells him to relax, saying he wants to speak directly to the person in charge. The captain warns him that if he tries anything funny, he is going to regret it big time. Kettle just says he knows and walks right past him. One of the mercenaries whispers, asking if it's really a good idea to let him get close to her. The captain points out that their employer already agreed, but the tension in the air is thick. Another guard suggests they should just stop him anyway. The captain scoffs, asking how in the world they're supposed to do that. The butler, who's about to have a meltdown, questions what she's just done. Milena tells him to keep his cool. Just then, Kettle knocks on the carriage and politely asks if he can come in. The butler looks like he's about to have a full-blown panic attack as Milena gulps and invites the huge man inside. Kettle just grins. Inside the carriage, the butler is squeezed into a corner, sitting stiff as a board, while Kettle, on the other hand, seems completely relaxed. Kettle tells the butler to take it easy, promising that he's not there to hurt anybody. The butler, shaking like a leaf, insists that he's got to be lying. Milena, however, is totally captivated, unable to hide her sheer awe at seeing a legendary barbarian up close and personal. She says that it's a real pleasure to meet him. Kettle replies that the pleasure is all his, and remarks on how surprisingly cozy the carriage is, mentioning that even with good insulation, keeping it this warm in a blizzard must be pretty tough. She just smiles and explains that it's all thanks to the power of magic. Kettle's eyes light up, saying he's genuinely thrilled to finally witness magic for himself, especially in a world like this one. She looks a bit confused, not quite sure what he means by that. So he starts to explain. He tells her that the White Wasteland is an extremely dangerous place. The chances of them surviving this trip with only those mercenaries are practically zero. That's why he plans on keeping them safe. But he adds that he has one small condition. They both look a little nervous, and Mina asks what it is he wants. He answers that all he's looking for is knowledge about the world, beyond these snowfields. He says that the information they have is the only thing he really desires. She's a bit shocked by how simple his request is. Kettle just points out that it's a fair trade, and that she should really agree to it. Not that she has much of a choice, Mina thinks to herself, but she says she understands. Kettle gives a nod of approval and asks for her name. She introduces herself formally, full title and everything. Kettle in return simply introduces himself. He says he's looking forward to their new arrangement. Then he shares that he has always dreamed of living in a fantasy world. Then one day, he just opened his eyes and found himself here as a barbarian in a never-ending snowfield. There wasn't even time to question what was happening. The only things he knew were the biting cold and the monstrous beasts. To survive, he says he had to become the leader of a barbarian tribe, hunting and leading them all out of sheer desperation. He admits he's lost track of how many years have gone by. He says he spent countless days trying to get out of this wasteland, but every time he reached the edge, he ran smack into a magical barrier. Apparently, he has a quest that's still unfinished, and he's not allowed to leave the snowfield until it's complete. He explains that he was just about to give up, when for some mysterious reason, people from the outside world started to show up every now and then. That's when it finally clicked. The world beyond the snowfield is the very same fantasy world he'd always longed for his dream world. From that moment on, he switched his focus from simply surviving to actively searching for a way out. He pursued his quest with relentless determination. For example, during quest 295, he was tasked with taking down a giant lizard. He crushed monsters left and right and completed every single objective that was thrown at him, never once taking his eyes off the prize. Trapped in this frozen prison, every little scrap of information from outsiders became priceless. But he says that most of the humans he'd met before either freaked out and attacked him, or had already lost their minds like that emperor. This time, however, he feels like they can have a real conversation. He admits he can't even remember the last time he talked to someone intelligent, having been surrounded by nothing but clueless barbarians. Just then, he hears some sounds coming from outside. He notes that it looks like she's hauling weapons around. Milena is totally floored and asks how he could possibly know that. He says he can hear the unmistakable clinking of steel coming from the wagons, and that it's a sound he could never mistake. He then asks if there's a war going on, and she confirms that there is. The Empire and the Kingdom are at war. Kettle remarks, so the outside world isn't so peaceful either. She explains that while the Empire has the advantage in numbers and supplies, the Kingdom is still holding its own, all thanks to the hero and the Swordmaster protecting its borders. Kettle's ears perk up at that, surprised that both a hero and a Swordmaster are real. He asks what kind of powers they have. She asks if he's never heard of mysteries before. Kettle admits that he's never once stepped foot outside of the snowfields. She tells him she doesn't know all the specifics, but she's happy to share what people have told her. There's this force called mystery that only a handful of people can sense or use. Those who can are ranked by strength, with the lowest being third rate. Those are the folks who can barely sense the power. Second rate refers to people who can actually put it to use. First-rate individuals are those who can literally bring it into reality. She explains that mystery is a lot like mana or an aura. Typically, knights, mages, and spirit summoners fall into these ranks. But once you go beyond that, the whole system becomes kind of pointless. Some have completely transcended all limits. These transcendent beings can dominate mystery entirely with powers strong enough to split the heavens. The Swordmaster is supposedly one of them. The hero, on the other hand, is on a completely different level. He's someone who not only controls mystery, but can change the world just with his sheer presence. She adds that just having your power ranked and named is a huge honor. Even being classified as third rate is a sign of serious strength. Kettle just says that he wants to meet them. She looks completely stunned, asking if he's being serious. Kettle explains that he can't even remember how long he's been stuck here. His only goal was to survive, but now he sees things clearly. This snowfield is part of a huge fantasy world, and he has to see the rest of it. He smiles, saying it isn't just a wish, it's a necessity. Milena asks if he's actually a barbarian. Kettle says that's not far off, and judging by their reactions, they seem to have heard of his kind before. She confirms there are legends, which puzzles Kettle, so he asks her to tell him about them. She thinks it's a bit strange that he doesn't know the legends, seeing as he's a barbarian himself. She starts recounting the story of the Emperor, and Kettle says he remembers that guy, but he just figured he was insane. When she asks what he means, Kettle quickly waves it off as nothing, but acknowledges her legends are probably accurate, since he's run into people like that before. He then changes the subject, commenting on all the wagons and noting that she seems to be transporting a massive amount of weapons. He asks why she's bothering to cross the snowfield. She hesitates for a second, then admits they're in a really tough spot and she desperately needs a lot of money. When he asks why, she tells him her family has been in business for generations. They built up a huge fortune over the years, but jealous rivals sabotaged them and now they're buried in debt. This mission is her last hope to save her family's name. Kettle figures it out and says, in that case, you must be trying to sell weapons to the kingdom. She asks how he knew, and he reminds her that she already told him the Empire has plenty of supplies. So these weapons have to be for that struggling kingdom. He points out that even though he's not super familiar with how the outside world works, hauling this many weapons must be worth a crazy amount of money enough to make crossing this wasteland worth the risk. Then it hits him the only reason to cut through this snowfield is if the kingdom's land is right up against the Empire's. She's totally blown away by how fast he figured all that out. She mentions that according to the old stories, barbarians are supposed to be clueless brutes, which makes her wonder who this Kettle guy really is. But right at that moment, the carriage jolts to a stop, making her jump. The butler chimes in, asking what in the world is happening as a shrill scream rips through the air outside. Kettle casually remarks, sounds like we've got company. And just outside the carriage, a huge, goopy creature materializes. The captain starts to freak out, but Milena recognizes it instantly, crying out that it's a black slime. Kettle echoes the name, asking, "Oh, is that what they call these things?" She nods and explains that it's a monster that's all over the old records. When he asks what records, she tells him that tons of powerful warriors used to try and conquer this white wasteland. Most of them didn't make it back, but the few who survived wrote books about everything they encountered. And out of all the monsters they wrote about, the black slime pops up the most. So she turns to Kettle and asks if he's heard of them too. And he just goes, "Oh yeah, for sure, they're a bit chewy, but they taste pretty great." He even calls them his favorite snack. Melina looks absolutely grossed out and asks if he's being serious. He just tells her that if she's that curious, she should go snag one and give it a try. Yeah, that's a hard pass for her. Just then, the whole carriage starts shaking like crazy as the black slime barrels towards them, letting out a horrible shriek. The captain is yelling in a panic, and Melina is pleading with Kettle to do something. But Kettle doesn't even budge. She gets frustrated, demanding to know why he's just sitting there. Kettle just calmly explains that he has a contract with her. His job is to protect their lives, and he won't step in unless they're in real actual danger. When she asks what he means by that, he just says that the mercenaries can take care of this little problem. The black slime lunged forward, and the captain roared at his men to get their shields up. They managed to, but the shield wall barely held on. The impact sent the captain flying backward, right into a snowbank. Another one of the mercenaries charged in, screaming his head off with his axe held high, but the creature tossed him aside like a ragdoll, slamming him into the side of a carriage. Totally dazed, the guy dropped his weapon and yelled out in confusion, asking what on earth was going on. The slime then set its sights on the captain. He yelled a warning to his crew, telling them the monster only moves in a straight line and to spread out and attack together. The mercenaries got the message and quickly moved into new positions. One of them jumped in from the side and got a good slice across its face, which made it screech and shoot out a blast of purple gunk. Another mercenary lifted his spear and chucked it right into the slime's head. It went clean through, and for the very first time, the group saw they were actually getting somewhere. Feeling hopeful, the captain yelled for them to keep it up and then charged in himself, his sword glowing with a green aura as he slashed deep into the creature's body. He shouted that normal attacks were completely useless. They had to hit the core, hidden deep inside it. Working as a team, the mercenaries all closed in. The captain leaped into the air and plunged his blade straight down, completely shattering the core. And just like that, the black slime melted into a puddle. With the beast finally down, the mercenaries just stood there frozen for a moment before erupting into cheers, shouting that they couldn't believe they'd actually won. Melina was absolutely ecstatic, marveling out loud that they had really pulled it off. Kettle, on the other hand, looked totally unimpressed. In fact, his expression seemed more annoyed than anything. They pressed onward, but it wasn't long before they had to stop yet again. This time, a gigantic wolf was blocking their path. The mercenaries charged in without a second thought, aiming all their attacks at its throat. With a few well-coordinated strikes, they sliced deep wounds into its neck, until the massive beast finally bled out and collapsed. One of the mercs commented that the snowfield wasn't as terrifying as everyone made it out to be, saying the stories must be way overblown. But the captain warned them not to get cocky, reminding them they were barely even halfway through. Another mercenary started to doubt Kettle's abilities, pointing out that the barbarian hadn't done anything impressive at all. He figured that the stories, just like the ones about the Wasteland, were probably exaggerated, and that Kettle might just be a freeloader riding on their coattails. He suggested they at least put Kettle's skills to the test. Just then, a knock came from the side of the carriage. Melina called out, asking what was happening. Kettle simply glanced outside without saying a word. One of the mercenaries approached, saying he needed to speak with her. He explained that since they had a contract with her, it was their responsibility to ensure her safety. She thanked him, telling him how grateful she was that they'd accepted the job when everyone else was too scared to take it. The mercenary nodded, but then said there was one thing they couldn't just ignore. Kettle hadn't lifted a single finger during any of the fights. She tried to come up with an excuse, but he cut her off, asking bluntly if they could test Kettle to see if he really deserved the special treatment he was getting. She looked over to the captain, who admitted with a sigh that he had already tried to stop them. But they just wouldn't listen. Kettle just smirked, saying that if they really wanted to test him, he didn't mind at all. But, he added, now isn't really the right time. They asked him what he meant, and he casually replied that they had some guests arriving. The mercenaries scoffed, demanding to know what kind of nonsense he was talking about. Right then, a deep, mocking voice echoed all around them. A monster hissed that the fragile mortals had arrived, and that today was going to be a grand feast. It cackled that it would savor their fear and told them to struggle because their panic would be the best seasoning. Milena screamed and covered her ears. The wind suddenly grew sharper and colder, howling around the group. The mercenaries tensed up, but Kettle stood there perfectly calm. He stated plainly that this was enough. The people with him were his guests, and he told the creature to turn back now. The serpent questioned his authority, accusing him of forgetting his place and wandering way too far from his tribe's territory. Kettle cut him off, saying it was none of his concern. The snake, enraged, began to whip the wind into a massive cyclone, screaming its identity and threatening to show Kettle what true power looked like. But Kettle just replied that it was about time the snake learned some respect. He pulled his fist back and drove it straight into the serpent's gut. A powerful shockwave ripped through the air. Snow exploded in all directions. The serpent recoiled in pure agony as a massive blue burst of energy followed. The ground trembled so hard from the force that the mercenaries could barely keep their footing. A second shockwave erupted, and this one was even stronger. Melina and the butler braced themselves, almost getting swept off their feet. The massive serpent was just whimpering in the snow, and Kettle casually remarked that some creatures just need a good old-fashioned beatdown to learn their lesson. Milena called out to him, and he cheerfully replied that he was just wrapping things up. He promised it wouldn't be much longer. Then with a powerful stomp, he blasted forward again. The serpent, not quite out of the fight, tried to rear up only to get clocked with another devastating punch that set off a massive explosion. Milena could only watch with her jaw on the floor, totally speechless. A little while later, the mercenaries were bowing their heads, trembling in their boots. They confessed they had messed up big time and begged for mercy. Kettle, however, responded calmly, saying that he totally understood. It was only natural not to trust a complete stranger so easily. As they got back on the road, the poor butler looked like he was about to turn into a human icicle, shivering violently. Kettle gave him a quick glance, then turned to Melina and mentioned that something about her was bugging him. He explained that based on how she dressed and talked, she didn't seem like your average agent working for her family. He flat out asked why she was risking her neck on such a dangerous trip. She couldn't help but admit he was sharp. And then she revealed her true identity. She announced that she was the first daughter of Lady Beliaka, who was a concubine to Lord Kestakasha. Kettle put two and two together and asked, "So that makes your mother the second wife, then?" She confirmed it, explaining her mom was part of a political marriage and was then basically tossed aside. She described her mother as a truly pitiful figure, completely powerless, and treated more like a servant than family. For all intents and purposes, she and her mother were members of House Akasha in name only. Realizing she might be oversharing, she chuckled and said aloud that his quiet listening had tricked her into rambling. She then clarified that she had personally volunteered for this trade mission, even though the journey could be deadly. Someone had to step up and take the lead, so she did. Kettle simply told her that she was incredibly smart. He added that she had powerful ambition and that a bit of greed in the right hands was actually a virtue. She looked at him, completely caught off guard, and about to reply when they were interrupted by shouting from outside. They both turned just as Milena's eyes widened in shock. The captain was yelling that they had made it. Right in front of them, grass was poking through the snow. They had finally crossed the white wasteland. The mercenaries erupted in celebration, giving Kettle their most sincere thanks. He just smiled and asked how they planned on making the trip back. Milena chimed in, saying that by then she'd be able to travel through the Empire without any trouble. Kettle nodded, saying that made perfect sense. Once she sold the weapons and was traveling light, crossing borders would be a breeze. Milena then brought the conversation back to what he'd said earlier about her being intelligent and ambitious. She wanted to know exactly what he meant by that. Kettle replied that he meant exactly what he said. He explained that while she was obviously very intelligent, it was her ambition that really stood out. Her family, which was once a great power, was now on the brink of financial collapse. And even though she was only the daughter of a concubine, the fact that she chose to act, while everyone else was frozen in panic, would definitely not go unnoticed. He concluded that in times of crisis, people will always rally behind the one person brave enough to lead. Her goal was crystal clear. She wanted to take control of her family. She challenged him, asking if he thought her plan was flawed. Kettle just replied that it was a perfect answer. She admitted that he wasn't wrong at all. Kettle then nodded, saying that now everything was starting to make sense. You know the story of a concubine's kid risking it all to restore their family's honor? It's a classic tale of ambition. And she couldn't help but think about how smart Kettle was, realizing he wasn't like those other arrogant fools who just thought they were clever. After all, he took down the white serpent without getting a single scratch on him. She couldn't help but think that if he were on her side, everything would be completely different. So she asks if he's ever thought about leaving the snowfields and maybe joining her. He turns her down, at least for now, explaining that he still has some unfinished business to take care of in the snowfields. She looked a little bummed out, but she bounced back in a flash, figuring this wasn't necessarily a final no. She reaches into her bag, pulls out a pendant, and offers it to him, asking if he'll accept it. She tells him that if he ever finds himself in the outside world and looks up her family, he should show them the pendant as proof. He tells her that if it's a gift, he'll be more than happy to take it. She thanks him and says she truly hopes they'll meet again someday. Kettle feels the same way. Her carriage then heads off into the woods, disappearing between the trees. And just like that, 5 years fly by. At long last, all the conditions have finally been met. Kettle has completed a whopping 784 quests, and the time has come. He's finally allowed to leave the snowfields. His face just lights up with pure, genuine excitement. He takes a deep breath, just trying to savor the fresh air. He says out loud that this is everything he's missed. The smell of grass, the sound of flowing water, sensations that were completely missing in that frozen wasteland. He turns back to the vast white plains and yells into the wind that he hopes he never has to come back. He muses that this strange, magical world was the very one he dreamed of even in his sleep. It's a land of illusions, of mystery and of wonder. A world he honestly thought he'd never reach. Even though his whole reincarnation got off to a rocky start, he somehow survived against all odds, and now he could finally embrace the world of swords, magic, dragons, and elves, a true fantasy. He admits that without that dream, he probably would have died a long time ago. Surviving the snowfields took more than just a will to live. It demanded a full-blown obsession. As he's walking, he spots some glowing lights in the distance and assumes it has to be a village. He gets totally giddy at the thought of finally meeting some actual civilized people. He remembers trying to talk to the barbarians who lived in little snow holes, attempting to discuss things like shelter, only to be met with these completely blank, clueless stares. He thinks about how much he misses human villages and starts to wonder what he should even say when he gets there. He debates with himself whether to start with a simple hello or just jump right into asking questions about the world. Whatever he decides, he's determined to be a perfect gentleman. As he gets closer, though, he notices the trees. They're unlike any he's ever seen, with a very distinct structure and a faint, otherworldly glow. Meanwhile, deep within that same forest, an elf stretches out his hand and announces that this will be their new home. The other elves break out in smiles and excitement, immediately starting to unload their supplies. One of the younger elves, however, raises a concern. The elder turns to him and asks what's troubling him. The younger elf says he isn't sure if the area is truly safe. The elder says that, of course it is, assuring everyone that their new home is extremely remote and that humans can't possibly reach it. The younger elf says he knows that, but points out that the snowy plains are right nearby. The elder just brushes off the concern. He says that for thousands of years, absolutely nothing has ever come out of those snowfields. Besides, they've set up a powerful barrier, one that's designed to hide their presence and make the forest seem completely normal and boring. He explains that this powerful barrier took months to create, woven together with ancient elven magic. As long as it's up, nobody can find them. He adds that even if a monster from the snowy fields managed to get close, it wouldn't be a real threat. But as Kettle strolls along, he unknowingly sticks his hand right through the edge of the barrier. It rips under his touch, just like a piece of fabric. He stops for a second, feeling that strange sensation and wondering what on earth he just ripped. He glances around, trying to get his bearings and figure out how much farther he has to walk. And that's when he sees her, a little elf girl, obviously lost and wandering all by herself in the woods. Kettle's jaw drops. He can't believe he's already run into an elf, a real-life elf. He immediately thinks this must be fate. After all, elves are a staple of any true fantasy world, so meeting one this early has to be a sign of good fortune. But the little girl looks absolutely terrified. The forest doesn't look familiar to her anymore. She's clearly strayed way too far from home. Suddenly she feels a massive shadow fall over her. Her eyes go wide with terror as Kettle leans down to greet her with what he genuinely believes is a friendly hello. To her, though, it sounds more like a terrifying threat. She completely freezes up and then starts to faint. Kettle acts fast, catching her just before she hits the ground, wondering what in the world is wrong. He sighs to himself, bummed that he didn't even get to have a proper conversation before she passed out. Seeing as things are, he figures the best thing to do is take her back to her village. He recalls that elves are usually depicted as peaceful beings, You know all about order and goodness. He thinks that if he returns their lost little one, they'll probably welcome him with open arms. He grins at the idea, gently lifting the girl into his arms and starting to walk back in the direction she came from. Meanwhile, back in the elven village, total panic has erupted. A woman is frantically screaming that her child is missing. The whole elven community is in chaos. They're demanding to know how a human could have possibly gotten through their barrier. Just then, Kettle shows up at the edge of town carrying the little girl. The situation immediately gets a whole lot worse. The girl's mother cries out in relief, but everyone else is just staring in stunned disbelief. The elder screams in horror, demanding to know how a human could possibly be standing there. He repeats that the barrier was supposed to keep any and all outsiders away. The scouts rush to report that they've found a tear in the magical barrier. Gandalf demands to know the queen's location. Someone shouts back that she's currently out on patrol. Kettle tries to get a word in, attempting to explain he means no harm. But the elves just scream at him, warning that if he doesn't hand over the child right now, they'll hunt him down. The elder mutters under his breath that the humans must have been well prepared. He reasons that no simple trick could have broken their powerful barrier. He starts to wonder how long the humans have known about them and just who might be tracking their movements. Kettle, completely confused, wonders out loud if he's just been branded an intruder. He lets out a sigh, realizing he's got to clear up this whole misunderstanding. Just then, the little girl's eyes flutter open. She looks surprised to see Kettle gently setting her down. He tells her to go on back to her family. But when she looks up at his face, she immediately lets out a blood-curdling scream as his rugged and unfamiliar face fills her with pure terror. She bursts into tears and bolts straight into her mother's arms. Kettle just stands there totally bewildered and wonders aloud if his face is really that scary. He mumbles that he always thought he had a pretty decent face. He then raises his voice, declaring that he's returned the child and repeating that he is not their enemy. The elder just screams, "The hostage is safe," and orders everyone to attack. In an instant, dozens of elves draw their bows and let their arrows fly. Magical arrows fill the air, streaking toward him. Kettle can't believe it and asks if they're all deaf. He just shakes his head, concluding that elves are way more savage than he'd ever imagined. He'd always pictured elves as these peaceful, nature-loving types, all about harmony and grace. But these elves, they were completely wild. And you know what? He quickly changed his mind, realizing it actually made perfect sense. I mean, if you live out in the wilderness, you've got to live by the law of the jungle, and survival is anything but peaceful. Nature doesn't play favorites. It picks the strong. So of course they're like this. Meanwhile, the arrows just kept bouncing off his skin without leaving a scratch. More archers took aim and fired again. They started guessing that he must be rocking some super powerful artifact to block all their attacks, but hey, even artifacts have their limits, right? They all agreed to just keep shooting until whatever he had gave out. That's when Kettle raised both hands in the air, telling them to just chill out. Then in one smooth motion, he clapped his hands together. The shockwave that followed absolutely tore through the forest. It was a massive, thunderous boom that just shattered the silence, a real explosion of pure, raw power. The elves were almost knocked clean off their feet. They were stumbling all over the place, yelling for someone to get the barrier up, but it was way too late for that. The shockwave from Kettle's simple clap sent them flying into the air like leaves in a hurricane, and it didn't just mess up their formation either. It also completely shattered the barrier that was supposed to keep their home hidden, sending spiderwebs of magical energy cracking through the entire forest. The elder started shaking, demanding to know what in the heck had just happened. Kettle, finally seeing the total mess he'd made, called out to the elves, trying to tell them again that he wasn't the bad guy here. And that's when it hit him. Oops, he forgot to hold back his strength again. Just as he was raising his voice to try and calm them down, a fiery arrow shaped like a bird came soaring toward him from up high. He just looked up casually, watching it fly right before it detonated in a massive fiery explosion. As the smoke cleared, it revealed a woman standing on a rocky ledge. Her presence alone made the whole forest go quiet. Gandalf and the others just froze, totally stunned by her sudden appearance. This was their queen, the legendary hero of EPI and the ruler of the Leaf Clan, Marcelia Hussein Kuja. Looking down at Kettle, Marcelia demanded to know what was going on. The elder piped up right away, telling her a human had attacked them. Marcelia's eyes narrowed as she said that if that was true, then even this hidden little sanctuary of theirs wasn't safe anymore. Kettle just casually brushed some smoke off his face and called up to her, asking if he could have a moment to explain everything. He said he'd really appreciate it if she'd just hear him out. Marcelia just stared at him, completely baffled that he was totally unharmed. The elder was muttering in disbelief, wondering out loud how in the world he was still standing after taking a direct hit from her. Marsalia glared down at Kettle with more and more disgust, asking why someone as incredibly powerful as him would be bothering them. She then declared with pure venom in her voice that she absolutely despised humans. She drew back her bow with incredible precision and fury, announcing her name and her title as the Queen of the Leaf Clan. She told him he was about to pay the price for his greed in trying to find them. Kettle started to wonder out loud if maybe they just couldn't hear him, or perhaps if they were speaking a different language even though it was pretty clear they weren't. He thought, are they just ignoring me, or is the relationship between elves and humans really this bad? He just shrugged his shoulders, saying there wasn't much of a choice left. After all, the one big thing he'd learned back in the snow plains was that some people only start listening after you've knocked some sense into them. With that, Marsalia began to weave different elements into her attack. Once it was fully charged, she let it fly. A gigantic wave of water came surging through the air with terrifying speed, and Kettle he stepped right into it without a second thought. He pulls his fist back and just obliterates the spell, sending a counterattack, zipping right back along the same path, which explodes upward toward Marsalia. Kettle immediately starts kicking himself under his breath, realizing he forgot to go easy on her again. All you can hear next is her scream as the blast makes contact and she collapses to the ground. Her eyes wide and gasping for air, Kettle just watches, wincing and wondering if he just made everything a whole lot worse. Marsalia, trembling, manages to say that from that single exchange she could tell he wasn't just some strong guy. No, he was way beyond the level of a transcendent. She wonders out loud why in the world someone with his kind of power would show up here. She then screams at her people, ordering them to run for their lives. The villagers cry out her name in a panic, but she just repeats her command, yelling for them all to escape. As the elves begin to retreat, she turns back to Kettle and says that while she acknowledges his strength, he will absolutely never accomplish whatever it is he came here to do. Kettle just groans, saying all he wanted was to talk, and he can't believe things have spiraled this far out of control. Marsalia closes her eyes and starts chanting. A fierce red aura builds in her palms, swirling like a vortex. She opens her eyes again, and floating above her is a massive fireball, its center slowly hardening into a solid form. That form takes the shape of a bull. A massive, powerful bull with horns made of pure blazing fire. Its name is Figo. Kettle's face lights up like a little kid's. Totally mesmerized by what he's seeing, he exclaims that this is the first real summon he has ever laid eyes on. Those creatures from the snowfields, he says, were just grotesque monsters that barely counted as magical. But this right here is the real deal. It's bringing to life the fantasy world he's always imagined. Marsalia commands the spirit to completely annihilate her enemy. Figo groans and starts complaining, saying that contracts are always way more trouble than they're worth. He adds that this is a huge pain, especially for a high-grade fire spirit like himself. Marsalia snaps at him to be quiet. She knows she barely has the power to summon him, and the contract was only possible thanks to help from another tribe. She never in a million years expected to use it in a situation like this. But she tells him he needs to do his job. Figo asks if the target is the human standing in front of them. Then he glances over at Kettle and immediately starts to sweat. He asks if that thing is even human as Kettle just stares at him, his eyes sparkling with pure wonder. Kettle, still totally awestruck, says that this is just absolutely incredible. Marsalia just repeats her order that the intruder must be destroyed. Figo sighs and announces that he's made his decision. He'll turn the human to ash and make sure not a single trace is left. Kettle frowns and asks aloud what on earth he did to deserve any of this. Figo's flames flare up as he prepares to charge. He scrapes his hooves against the ground, sending sparks everywhere, and then barrels toward Kettle at full speed. A gigantic explosion erupts at the point of impact. Marsalia braces herself against the powerful shockwave. When the smoke finally clears, she sees something that should be completely impossible. Kettle is standing there totally unshaken, with his hands casually locked around Figo's horns. Even Figo looks completely stunned. Kettle cracks a huge grin and says, "This is a relief, since it's a beast. That means I don't have to hold back. It'll be a lot easier to just beat the stuffing out of him." Marsalia's eyes fly open in horror as Kettle slams his fist right into Figo's forehead. The very ground beneath them shatters like glass. The force doesn't just stop with the spirit, oh no, it plows straight through it, carving a massive trench in the landscape behind them like a cannonball of pure holy justice. A huge shockwave erupts outward, launching bits of the forest everywhere. Marcelia cries out as she falls to her knees, completely overwhelmed by that insane display of power. She watches in utter disbelief as the fire spirit is just gone. She whispers to herself that this can't possibly be real. As Kettle takes a slow step toward her, she looks up, her eyes wide with fear. She starts pleading for mercy, not for herself, but for her people. He calmly tells her again that he isn't her enemy. Marcelia just blinks, totally lost. This time she really hears his voice for what it is, not a threat, but a genuine plea. She asks him what he could possibly mean. Now that they're finally taking a breath to talk, they actually start to reach an understanding. Kettle explains the whole situation, and Marcelia listens intently. It finally dawns on her that he really truly means them no harm. She bows her head low and apologizes, admitting that she acted recklessly and jumped to the worst conclusion. They mistook him for one of the humans who nabbed their child, and now she realizes they've made a terrible mistake. The guilt starts to hit her hard, and she admits that her judgment was completely out of line. Kettle just gives her a calm look of reassurance, saying it's all right. He gets it. After all, they made it pretty clear they were being hunted by humans, so he understands why they were so cautious. Still, he says it's a little sad that no one even gave him a second to explain himself. She hesitates, then asks him point blank, "Are you absolutely sure you're not one of the humans chasing us?" Kettle replies that this is actually his first time ever laying eyes on an elf. He points out that there certainly aren't any of them back in the White Wasteland. A spark of realization hits her as she asks, "Wait, does that mean you're one of the Ashen barbarians?" Kettle nods, confirming that's what outsiders call his people. She says that shouldn't be possible since no human is supposed to survive the White Wasteland. If he managed to come from there, then maybe others could too. Kettle just shrugs, saying he's not so sure about that. He explains that the snowfield is governed by some very strict rules, and even crazy powerful creatures like the great serpents have to obey them. For some reason he doesn't quite get, he was able to slip past those rules thanks to the conditions of a special quest. But he's pretty sure an exception like that is incredibly rare. "That's a relief to hear," she says. Then she asks if his summon the fire spirit he just wrecked is going to be okay. He did kind of split that fiery bull in half, so he's not too optimistic. She explains that spirits, being creatures of nature, just get sent back to the spirit realm when they're forcibly unsummoned, so no permanent harm done. She pulls herself together and acknowledges how rude she's been. As a gesture of her apology, she asks if there's anything he wants, promising she'll do whatever is in her power to grant it. Kettle, his curiosity sparked, immediately asks about the spirit, wondering if only elves can make contracts with them. She answers that, while it's not common, there are a few rare humans with a very strong bond to nature who can form pacts with spirits. But for pretty much everyone else, it's a total impossibility. "So there's really no chance for me?" he asks. She thinks about it for a moment, then says that if he's truly serious about it, he should go to a place called El Pesrado. Kettle immediately asks what that is, and she tells him it's the sacred land where the god of the elves lives, a place all elves revere. There, she suggests perhaps even he could form a contract. His face lights up with pure excitement as he asks if a human like him could actually get in. She explains that normally it would be absolutely forbidden, but with a personal introduction from her, it just might be possible. She then offers to give him its location, but he's got to keep this information top secret. She warns him that El Paso is the ultimate dream destination for every single elf researcher out there. To elves, it's a place so sacred no elf would ever risk its discovery, but she tells him she wants to put her faith in him. And as a sign of that trust, she hands him a small token. He graciously accepts it, and she adds that if he actually manages to get close, their god might just decide to test him, though she's confident he'll pass. She then formally reintroduces herself as the queen of the Leaf Tribe and asks for his name. Kettle's reply is simple: he's just a barbarian. No fancy titles, no special status. A little while later, we see Kettle absolutely tearing through the forest at full speed, the ground shaking with every step as he heads toward the destination she gave him. Each stride sends a boom echoing through the trees. Over in a nearby city, a guard's head snaps up, totally alarmed by the thunderous noise that's getting closer. They're stationed at the border of Barkon territory, which is inside the kingdom of Chant. The head guard yells for everyone to get ready for a fight. Whatever is coming, it's coming in hot. And then just as suddenly, the booming stops. The sound of heavy stomping shifts to a slow, deliberate walk. Kettle steps out from the tree line, and the head guard just stares, completely speechless. Kettle gives a friendly greeting, asking if they're the local guards. He cracks a smile and says it's nice to meet them. They just gawk at him in disbelief, not saying a word. They immediately notice his ashen gray hair and the massive scar running across his chest. Someone whispers that it has to be the Ashen Barbarian, so the rumors were true after all, even if earlier translations of the stories made them sound a bit far-fetched. As Kettle walks closer, they shout at him to stop right there, warning him that one more step means they'll attack. He calmly raises his hands, letting them know he's not an enemy. They ask him what his business is. Kettle simply points past the wall. When they ask if he's trying to enter the territory, he replies that he just wants to visit, and maybe if it's okay, stay for a little while. He's not quite sure how long. The scene cuts to Kettle talking with the captain. The captain asks for his name, and Kettle gives it to him. The captain then asks for some form of ID, or proof of identity. Kettle says he doesn't have any, but after thinking for a second, a light bulb goes off. He pulls out the pendant Melina gave him and asks if this is good enough. The captain takes it for a closer look, asking what it is. Kettle explains that it's the crest of House Akasha, a gift from someone directly from the bloodline. The captain nods, recognizing the name. He mentions that House Akasha is a merchant family from the Damian Kingdom. He even adds that they've been getting pretty famous in recent years, right after a new leader took over. So Kettle asks if the pendant is enough to confirm who he is. The captain replies that while it isn't definitive proof, it looks legitimate and definitely helps his situation. He grants Kettle entry, but there are a few conditions. Kettle, of course, asks what the catch is. The captain explains that there are several other folks with questionable backgrounds also trying to get in. To test everyone's trustworthiness, all of them have to team up and clear out a nearby dungeon together. Kettle remarks that this sounds way easier than he expected and happily accepts. The captain then adds one last requirement: they have to report back on every single thing that happens inside that dungeon. Kettle figures out the reason right away, by forcing all the sketchy individuals to keep an eye on each other. The guards can easily spot any suspicious activity. He comments on how clever that is. The captain just smirks and asks one more time if he's really just a barbarian. Kettle agrees, mentioning how a lot of folks still think barbarians are just mindless brutes. The captain points out that Kettle is the first barbarian to ever set foot in their territory, and with that, he cuts the conversation short and orders them to get going. Meanwhile, in a nearby prep room, an older gentleman lets out a heavy sigh, grumbling that even if the law says he has to teaming up with thieves for a dungeon run is just unbearable. He formally introduces himself as Alejandro Tyrannus, a paladin. The rogue next to him, a guy named Cason Hark, immediately starts making fun of his stuffy tone, guessing he's just sore about getting ripped off by some other thief. Alejandro, absolutely furious, whips out his sword and starts yelling right back. Casen just scoffs at his title, retorting, "Paladins don't usually dress like they're homeless." Then he starts laughing at Alejandro's last name, calling it totally absurd. In response, Alejandro just tightens his grip on his sword, and the two of them immediately start to fight, their blades ringing against each other. Noticing Casen's daggers are tipped with poison, a woman sighs and tells them to cut it out. They both look over as she grumbles that she can't believe she has to go into a dungeon with these two. It turns out she's a cleric of Kia, and her name is Hayes. She explains that the minimum party size is 4, so their last member should be here any minute. Still, she can't shake the feeling that something's off about this whole situation. Just then, the door creaks open. The guard captain announces that their last member has finally arrived. Casen just mutters, hoping this one isn't a total lunatic. As the door swings open wider, the massive form of Kettle has to duck just to get inside. Everyone just stares, completely stunned. Kettle just gives them a big friendly smile and asks if they're his new teammates. The rest of the group instinctively takes a step back, totally awestruck by his presence. Casen can only mumble in disbelief, completely overwhelmed by the powerful aura Kettle is giving off. Kettle cheerfully introduces himself and asks for their names too. Casen's still a bit stunned, just says he's a thief. Alejandro follows, stating he's a paladin. Kettle asks about his holy powers, but Alejandro explains that he's a special case and can't actually use any. Kettle just nods, taking it in stride. Then Hayes introduces herself as a cleric, who serves Calathea, the god of lies and deceit. Kettle wonders if that means people can't ever be sure about her. She confirms that's right, explaining that her deity isn't exactly popular, so people tend to be pretty suspicious of her. A little later, the guard captain comes back and asks if they're all set to go. Kettle gives a confident nod, but the others look way less certain. Before long, they arrive at the dungeon entrance, and Kettle looks absolutely thrilled. You can tell it's his very first one. The captain lays out the mission. The dungeon has 3 floors crawling with undead. Their job is to clear it out and bring back proof of their success. Kettle claps his hands together enthusiastically and says it's time to get started. He then turns to Casson and asks for the game plan. A nervous Casson addresses him as Sir but Kettle just waves it off, saying there's no need to be so formal since they're all teammates now. Casson clears his throat a little flustered and lays out the plan. He and Alejandro will take point at the front. Casson's job will be to scout ahead for traps, while Hayes provides support from the rear. Kettle says that sounds simple enough and gives the okay. With that, they start heading down into the dungeon. Once inside, the party moves forward with caution. Everyone's on edge, their eyes darting around the shadows. Hayes mentions how creepy the darkness is, and Casson agrees. The dungeon feels way too quiet, almost normal. Suspiciously normal, in fact. All of a sudden, Casson freezes up, throwing a hand out to signal the group to stop. He whispers that there are monsters close by. Kettle looks around confused and says he doesn't see a thing. Casson just points down at the floor and draws their attention to the bone fragments scattered in a specific pattern. He explains that they're skeletons just lying dormant until someone triggers them. The moment they get too close, they'll spring to life and attack. Casson grumbles that the guard captain must have known about this the whole time. He realizes this dungeon isn't just a test to verify who they are. It's a setup designed to quietly get rid of any outsiders they don't want around. Gazing at the bone fragments, Kettle casually mentions he's never actually fought a skeleton before. Cohen quickly warns him that these things are seriously no joke. He explains that even if you hurt them, they just keep coming. Their bones are crazy tough, giving them a super high defense stat. Cohen adds that this dungeon is way more dangerous than he first thought, then tells Hayes to get her magic ready. He tells Alejandro to brace his shield and advises Kettle to keep his eyes peeled. Cohen says he'll search for an opening mid-fight, warning them that just chipping away at a skeleton won't cut it. He stresses they have to go for the neck. That's their weak spot. He finishes by saying it usually takes a bunch of hits to finally break through. Kettle just nods along, complimenting Cohen on his impressive leadership and confirming he's got the plan down. With that, Cohen gives the signal to begin. Kettle moves forward, slow and steady, just as one of the skeletons starts glowing with mana, its bones snapping themselves into an upright position. Kettle watches, a little surprised, as the figure fully assembles and locks its empty gaze on the party. Alejandro tenses up. Hayes starts chanting, and Cohen melts into the shadows. All set to flank the enemy. The skeleton charges straight ahead, its blade drawn. Kettle pulls back for a swing, but not with a fist. But with an open palm, and he slaps the creature so hard it just explodes into a pile of dust. He blinks, looking slightly let down, and wonders out loud if they're really that flimsy. The rest of the party is just completely speechless. Alejandro is floored. Hayes looks seriously disturbed, and Cohen is just frozen, unable to believe what he just saw. Kettle just lets out a chuckle and says, "Well, just like you said, Cohen, once the head's gone, the skeleton stops moving." Cohen sputters that that's not what he meant at all. He tries to explain that skeleton bones aren't normal. They're supercharged with the dungeon's mana. They're incredibly dense, super tough, and are famous for being almost impossible to break. Even master swordsmen have a hard time cutting through them in one hit, without using aura. Turning one into dust like that should be flat out impossible. Cohen admits he knew Kettle was strong, but not this strong. He starts to wonder if Kettle is even human. That pile of dust in front of them is all the proof they need. Kettle had completely obliterated the monster without even trying. He just turns around and calmly says they should probably get a move on. The others immediately scramble to follow him, no questions asked. He tells them there's no need to rush, but they don't say a word, just sticking close behind him. All of them trying their best to hide how scared they are. Cohen gives him a shaky salute, while Hayes and Alejandro share a worried look. They're both thinking the exact same thing. They really, really don't want to get on his bad side. As they keep going, Kettle suddenly stops in his tracks. It looks like he's spotted something. Cohen asks what's up, and then they all see it too. More skeletons are starting to form. Hayes yelps in alarm as the bones begin knitting themselves together. Cohen and Alejandro get ready for a fight, but Kettle just holds up a hand and asks if they could do him a little favor. They all pause, looking confused. He says he wants to take them on by himself because there's something he'd like to test out. They quickly agree, not having a clue what's about to happen. Hayes just gives a quiet little nod. Kettle then strolls toward the assembling skeletons, casually picking up a sword from one of the bone piles as the others watch with curiosity. Kettle looks over the weapon, commenting on how interesting it is that these things can just put themselves back together. Just then, one of the skeletons lunges right at him, swinging its sword straight down. Kettle casually pinches the blade between two fingers and snaps it clean in half. He grins, asking the skeleton what its plan is now. The skeleton repositions, gets a new grip on its broken weapon, and launches itself off a wall for another attack. This time, it manages to slice off a few strands of Kettle's hair. He doesn't even flinch. Instead, he grabs the creature's wrist and simply crushes it into dust. The skeleton's hand hits the floor with a clatter. It glances down, looking totally baffled, then glares back at Kettle and flips the broken sword up with its foot. It catches the hilt perfectly with its other hand. Kettle's eyes widen in delight like he's just seen a cool party trick, and he points out that it knows how to switch hands. He even calls it impressive. The skeleton rushes forward again, this time holding the blade in a reverse grip. Without breaking a sweat, Kettle just grabs its left wrist and yanks the whole arm off. The bony creature stumbles back, but quickly recovers, trying to stab him with the jagged stump. But Kettle catches that too, and snaps it effortlessly, remarking out loud that this one's actually pretty smart for a pile of bones. Hayes is just watching in absolute horror. From her perspective, it looks like Kettle is just toying with this monster, and it's clear Alejandro and Costin are thinking the exact same thing. This isn't a fight, it's a science experiment. Kettle casually bats the skeleton around, poking and prodding it, until its head finally pops off and clatters to the floor. He stares down at the skull and says, "Bet you can't move now." Then he just stomps it into dust. He actually starts laughing, calling the whole thing pretty amusing before turning to the group and apologizing for making them wait. Cohen, trying not to look terrified, quickly assures him it's no problem at all. Kettle just thanks him. The next thing you know, he's standing over another pile of dust. He's all ready to keep going. The others just nod really fast, saying they're ready whenever he is. Costin points them to a staircase, explaining it leads down to the second floor. As they're heading down, Costin cautiously suggests they take a little break. After thinking for a second, Kettle agrees, and Costin thanks him with a grateful bow. So they all find a spot to sit, but the vibe is super awkward and tense. Kettle just plops down, sitting cross-legged, and mentions he has a question about the dungeon. Hayes tells him to go ahead and ask anything. He admits it might be a little embarrassing, but he doesn't really have a good grasp on how dungeons work. Hayes gives him a warm smile, saying that wanting to learn is a noble thing. She adds that she's no expert, but she'll do her best to answer. Kettle thanks her for being so helpful. So he asks, why is this dungeon so close to their territory? Isn't that a huge threat? Hayes explains that, for the most part, dungeon monsters stay inside the dungeon. But she says there are rare exceptions, and when that happens, they're dealt with before they become a problem. Cohen clears his throat and decides to elaborate, explaining that dungeons are basically natural occurrences. They can show up as caves, towers, or even old ruins. He goes on to say that most dungeons tend to pop up near populated areas. Kettle nods, saying that makes sense then. Hayes jumps in, adding that whenever a dungeon appears, the local lord checks it out to see how dangerous it is. If it seems risky, they hire mercenaries and adventurers to clear it out. Kettle nods along, saying it all adds up. Then he asks if dungeons ever appear right inside a city. Hayes shakes her head and says, "Nope, never. They always form a little ways away." His next question is if you get rewards for clearing them. Hayes smiles and says, "Oh yeah, there's usually a boss at the very end, and if you beat it, you get some really valuable treasure." For a 3-floor dungeon like this one, she says, the rewards could be pretty amazing. Kettle just laughs and comments that it's exactly like a video game. Hayes gives him a confused look and asks what he means by that. Kettle just waves it off, saying he was just thinking out loud. Then he asks just one more thing. Who actually makes these dungeons? Hayes looks completely stumped. She tells him, well, nobody does. They're just a natural thing that happens. But Kettle doesn't buy it. He points out that there are way too many weird coincidences. For one, they always show up near people. Then they're always packed with monsters and treasure. He says it's almost like someone wants people to go explore them. Hayes just stops and thinks about that for a second, and then admits he's got a point. She'd never really questioned it before. It was just one of those things everyone accepted as true. Even Cohen agrees, saying the thought had never crossed his mind. That was just the way things were, so they all quietly wondered how a barbarian, a guy they assumed was completely primitive, was now questioning the very truths they'd believed their entire lives. I mean, barbarians are supposed to be savage and not too bright, right? That's what everyone thinks anyway. But Kettle didn't fit that stereotype at all. He just said the world is full of mysteries, and that's what makes it fun. Cohen finally snapped out of his thoughts, and Kettle asked if everyone was all rested up. They all said they were. Kettle stood up and said they should get going. They headed into the second floor, where Kettle's eyes landed on something interesting, a treasure chest just sitting there in the open. He pointed it out, asking what it was. Cohen explained that it was most likely a dungeon reward. but getting it open was a whole other problem. He mentioned that to unlock a chest of this caliber, they'd need a master-level rogue with some serious lock-picking skills, and unfortunately, he added a rogue that good would never be in a low-level dungeon like this one, so they would probably just have to leave it behind. Kettle just glanced at him and said he'd like him to open it anyway. Cohen whipped around, totally confused, and asked why in the world he would ask him to do it. Kettle just pointed to the big fancy box and declared that it was a treasure chest, and since Cohen was a rogue, it was obviously his job to open it. Cohen tried to argue, but Kettle cut him right off. He said firmly that handling treasure was a rogue's job, so Cohen was just doing what he was supposed to. Cohen had to admit that was technically correct, but deep down a wave of pure panic was washing over him. If he actually had the skill to open a high-grade chest, he wouldn't be stuck as some unregistered nobody, just barely scraping by. The truth was he had absolutely no idea how to pick locks. But when he looked at Kettle's face, which was lit up with pure childlike excitement, he just couldn't bring himself to confess. In his head, he pictured Kettle's disappointment turning into disgust, which would then be followed by a bone-pulverizing slap, like the one that had turned those skeletons to dust. So with a pained laugh and his heart crying in terror, he said he'd give it a shot. As he knelt down in front of the chest, his inner monologue was just pure, unfiltered desperation. He told himself that if he failed, he was probably not making it out of there in one piece. Kettle watched, totally intrigued, commenting on how fascinating the whole process looked. Cohen frantically tried to recall anything he saw while working as a porter for real thieves, but he came up with nothing. He whispered that this was a life-or-death moment, and that the honor of the entire Rose bloodline rested on his shoulders. His fingers fumbled with the lock until something clicked. His hands trembled as he looked up in total disbelief. It had actually opened. He was so happy he could have cried, and he muttered that maybe he was starting to really like Kettle after all. Hayes was amazed, saying she'd only heard of top-tier rogues cracking chests like that. Kettle gave him a sincere compliment, and Cohen just mumbled back that it really did seem impossible. In that one instant, he started to question everything, for the first time in his entire life. He wondered if he had ever really tried to live up to his potential, or if he had just been surviving. Kettle then asked how much the loot was worth. Hayes figured it could comfortably support a family for a month, or even let them live in the lap of luxury for a while. Kettle just laughed at that and told Cohen to take care of the rewards. Cohen instantly agreed, lifting the chest like it was sacred. When Kettle called his name, he let out a little shriek and almost dropped it. Kettle just innocently asked if he needed help. Cohen, looking all flustered, insisted he was totally fine, even though no one had a clue why he was so jumpy. Later on, as they pushed deeper into the dungeon, Cohen was hauling a small mountain of loot on his back when Kettle suddenly ordered everyone to a dead stop. Up ahead were 4 more skeletons. Kettle calmly announced that he'd be taking care of 3 of them, which left just 1 for the rest of the team to handle. Cohen knew right away this wasn't some kind gesture. This was a pop quiz, a test. He muttered that this was going to be a real fight, and both Alejandro and Hayes got themselves ready. As Kettle casually strolled forward, the skeletons began to rattle to life. Cohen grumbled that the way bones just clicked themselves together was always super creepy. As the 4 bony enemies rose, Kettle reminded everyone to get in the zone. Hayes cast a brilliant buff that wrapped the whole team in a golden glow. Kettle gave the go-ahead, and Cohen immediately lunged forward. He aimed right for the neck and landed a clean shot, but it just wasn't enough. The skeleton was still standing as the others started to move in and surround him. Kettle effortlessly snatched them and pulled them back, saying he'd already called dibs on those 3. He told the rest of the party not to butt in. This was their fight now. One skeleton brought its weapon down, and Alejandro blocked it with his shield, holding the baddie in place. Cohen used the opening to spring off a nearby wall and slam it in the back. Hayes then cast a disorienting spell, Shadow of Confusion, before bathing Alejandro in that awesome golden light. All powered up, Alejandro drove his sword toward the skeleton's neck. It cracked loudly but didn't go down. In fact, the skeleton actually laughed. And so did Kettle, who had, of course, already dealt with the other 3 skeletons. He just stood there watching the last one stumble around, saying it was genuinely fun to watch a team's dynamic in action. He then casually crushed one of the fallen skulls in his palm, adding that with the real threats gone, he could finally sit back and enjoy the show. Realizing their fight was being graded, the trio absolutely swarmed the last skeleton. It looked around completely confused and terrified as all 3 of them ganged up on it like a cornered raccoon. They were pretty certain Kettle would just get rid of them if they showed any weakness. When the fight was finally over, The skull was nothing but dust, and all three of them collapsed to their knees, totally exhausted. Kettle just muttered that the people Milena brought with her must have been pretty strong. After reaching the third floor, they ran into even more skeletons, but with Kettle around, they breezed right on through without much trouble. Eventually, they reached the heart of the dungeon, a massive chamber with a skeletal figure sitting on a throne. It was a skeleton knight. Hayes just stood there, her jaw on the floor, unable to believe what she was seeing. She quickly explained that these things were elite-level skeletons rocking longswords and shields. Only fighters at the knight level or higher had any real shot at beating them. For anyone else, it was basically a one-way trip. Kettle then asked what would happen if they couldn't win and decided to bail. Hayes replied that as long as they filed a reasonable report, the territory would probably accept it. But Kettle just smiled and started walking forward. Hayes yelled out in confusion, but he simply said that beating the monster seemed like a way more reasonable plan. The skeleton knight began to stir. Its aura was just radiating pure power. Kettle noted how fascinating it was to see a skeleton that had maintained its entire form. It then dropped into a low stance, preparing for a wide-range attack. Hayes screamed out a warning and threw up a barrier, but the incredible force of the skeleton knight's attack cracked it in an instant. Her magic just shattered. Alejandro threw himself in front of everyone, taking the full force of the blow with his shield before collapsing to the ground. He was totally out of breath, wondering how they could possibly fight something that powerful. Just then, the skeleton knight locked onto Kettle and came charging right at him. Kettle didn't even flinch, meeting it head-on with a single punch to the chest. The monster just disintegrated in the middle of its attack. Its entire torso obliterated. It crumpled into nothing but a pile of ash as the others just sat there completely stunned and speechless. Kettle casually dusted off his hands and asked, "Was that really all?" Before he spotted another treasure chest and called out to Cohen. When Cohen asked what he wanted, Kettle asked if he could pop it open. Cohen just shook his head, saying, "No way, that's a high-level lock way beyond my skills." Kettle just replied, "Aw, that's a shame." Before Cohen could even finish saying they'd have to leave it, Kettle hauled off and punched the chest. It completely shattered. At this point, no one even bothered to react. Kettle cheerfully noted this was a much easier way to get the rewards and told Cohen to go grab them. Cohen numbly agreed, his brain still trying to compute how someone could just punch open a high-tier lock. And really, if he could do that, why did he even ask him to unlock it in the first place? As the group made their way toward the exit, a bright light suddenly surrounded them, followed by a deep rumble from behind. They spun around just in time to see the dungeon collapsing. Kettle, of course, asked what was going on. Cohen explained that when a dungeon is cleared perfectly, it disappears, which apparently meant this one didn't have any secret rooms. Kettle's eyes lit up as he asked if rooms like that were a real thing. Cohen said yes, but they were super rare. Hearing that, Kettle just laughed, saying that sounded like a lot of fun. Cohen, still trying to wrap his head around Kettle's mindset, wondered what kind of lunatic would actually enjoy that. Back at the city gate, the guard captain was totally floored. He just couldn't believe they had finished the dungeon so quickly. He cleared his throat and asked them how it went. Kettle simply responded that it was pretty satisfying. The captain just nodded and started processing their return. He asked if they ran into any issues. Hayes told him that nothing major happened. But when the guard captain asked her specifically about Kettle, she said he was probably fine, but you could hear the hesitation in her voice. The captain knew better than anyone that clearing a dungeon wasn't just about making it out alive, it was a test of character too. Cohen chimed in that Kettle didn't seem like a bad guy. The captain had to agree, noting that despite his monstrous strength, Kettle never once put his party in danger. He was the complete opposite of the typical barbarian stereotype. Kettle then started praising Cohen, saying he did a great job with the traps and even opened a chest. He gave a shout out to Alejandro for being so reliable on the front lines and credited Hayes' prayers for boosting their chances of success. The guard captain was genuinely surprised. Normally, parties that were forced together just ended with everyone blaming each other. He handed over the rewards, and even though guards usually skim a little off the top for themselves, he didn't dare try it this time. Kettle insisted that they split all the loot evenly. The others tried to refuse, but he wasn't having any of it. He said they were a team and they earned it all together. Then he suggested they all go celebrate with some drinks at the pub. As they walked off, Kettle was practically bouncing with enthusiasm. The rest of the team just dragged their feet behind him, looking completely wiped out. The guard captain watched the group go, muttering to himself that for a barbarian to one-shot a skeleton knight, he had to be stronger than a regular knight, which meant he was far from ordinary. He declared that this was the start of something serious. Turning to his subordinates, He told them he had to report this to the Lord and left them in charge. A short while later, he arrived at the Lord's estate and knocked. From inside, Lord Luke Varkin called him in. The guard captain reported that a barbarian had just entered their territory. Luke immediately asked if he had been given permission. The captain agreed, saying he hadn't sensed any immediate threat. Luke, a bit confused, asked what the problem was. The captain then got straight to the point. The guy was just too strong. How strong are we talking? Luke pressed. The captain revealed that he'd taken down a skeleton knight in just one hit. That news completely floored Luke. I mean, a skeleton knight isn't something your average fighter can handle. He wondered aloud if the man could actually be a first-rate warrior. The captain confirmed the odds were pretty high. Luke rubbed his temples, already feeling a headache coming on. He muttered that a barbarian with that kind of power was bound to be a huge pain. Luke then ordered the captain to bring the barbarian to him right away. The captain paused for a moment, clearly wondering if that was such a good idea. Luke explained that having someone with that much raw power just wandering around his domain was a recipe for trouble, and that he'd sleep a lot better once he'd met the guy face to face. The captain tried to warn him again, stressing just how dangerous this could be, but Luke just brushed off the concern, saying there was no need to worry. After all, his knight was here. At that, the captain blinked in surprise. He hadn't even realized the knight was in the room. Luke then turned to this knight and asked for his take on the barbarian. The knight answered with an ice-cold confidence. He admitted that while the man might have some brute strength, he was at the end of the day just a barbarian, an unsophisticated oaf, with no real technique. Against his own refined swordsmanship, passed down from a true master, the man would fall apart. Luke nodded in satisfaction and told the captain to go get the barbarian. He wanted to have a little chat with him personally. Meanwhile, over at the pub, Kettle was absolutely demolishing a mountain of food, chomping away loudly without a care in the world for manners. The poor table was groaning under the weight of all the empty mugs and half-eaten plates. His companions just watched all three of them, looking pretty disturbed by how messy and overjoyed he was with his meal. Kettle slammed his mug of ale down with a grin, shouting about how awesome the food was. He loved the atmosphere too, said it was calm, relaxing, and just perfect. He reminded everyone that it was on him and told them to eat their fill. The others just gave him some stiff and totally awkward laughs in response. Kettle then turned to Alejandro and asked if he was for real a paladin. Alejandro said he was so. Kettle followed up, asking what kind of divine powers he had. He pointed out that he hadn't seen any miracles or holy spells back in the dungeon. Looking a little embarrassed, Alejandro admitted he was still just a trainee and that his powers hadn't really kicked in yet. Kettle said that was a real bummer. He'd been hoping to see some of that cool, holy power stuff up close. Alejandro just cleared his throat and looked away a bit flustered. So Kettle turned his attention to Hayes, asking about her god and if there was a temple for them nearby. Hayes explained, looking a little tense, that since her deity was the god of lies and deceit, they weren't exactly welcomed in most places. She said no temple around here would take her in. Just mentioning her god's name was enough to get you some nasty looks and a whole lot of suspicion. After a brief pause, she asked a pretty bold question. Just how strong was he anyway? Hearing that Costin and Alejandro's ears perked right up, Kettle didn't seem bothered by the question at all. He just replied that since he'd only left his homeland recently, he honestly had no clue how he stacked up against other people. He then added that he was actually curious himself about how tough that skeleton knight they fought was supposed to be. The others laid it out for him plainly. Look, to beat a skeleton knight, you've got to be at least a second-rate warrior, and maybe even first-rate. But to wipe one out in a single hit like you did, that's definitely first-rate territory, no question about it. Kettle blinked, completely baffled that such incredible strength was only considered second best. Before anyone could explain further, a nervous waiter hurried over, letting them know it was closing time. Kettle apologized and got to his feet, then asked the others if they had plans. All three of them, in perfect, almost rehearsed unison, said they were unbelievably busy and couldn't possibly hang out any longer. Kettle just nodded, saying it was a real shame and that he hoped their paths would cross again soon. They, however, did not share that hope. In fact, they all silently promised themselves they would never be in the same room with that man again if they could help it. Later on, Kettle checked into a quaint little inn and flopped onto the bed with a huge sigh of satisfaction. It was the first time he'd slept in a proper bed since showing up in this world. The reward money from the dungeon had more than covered the cost, and compared to the harsh, frozen plains he'd come from, this felt like absolute paradise. He thought back to the first time he'd woken up in that white wasteland. It had taken him a very long time to finally find his way to civilized lands. Now lying all snug in a warm room, He started to wonder what he should do next. He was itching for some real adventure, like seeing the sacred land of the elves, or visiting the royal capital, and maybe even climbing the legendary magic tower. All the classic spots you'd expect in a proper fantasy world. Just the thought of it all got him super excited. The next morning, sunlight poured through his window. Kettle stirred, wiped a little drool off his cheek, and sat up just as a knock sounded at his door. The first captain was standing right outside. He apologized for the early wake-up call and said that the lord of the territory wanted to see him in person. Kettle blinked, looking surprised. He mentioned that a noble lord wanting to meet a guy like him was certainly unexpected, but hey, he was totally on board. He asked if they should head out right away, adding that he could get dressed in a flash. The captain once again found himself questioning if this was truly the same man who could one-shot a dungeon boss. He was taking this way too casually. As they walked through the city, Kettle gazed around with wide-eyed wonder. The night before, the streets had been dark and empty. But in the morning sun, everything was so vibrant and alive. He exclaimed that it was just like a video game, marveling at every single detail. The captain, getting more impatient by the second, told him they were going to take a shortcut to avoid any more distractions. Soon enough, they arrived. The captain announced that the barbarian had been brought as requested. Luke gave the order for him to enter. As the doors opened, he extended his hand in a welcoming gesture and formally introduced himself as the lord of the domain. Kettle responded warmly, using Luke's title respectfully, and introducing himself as simply Kettle the Barbarian. He even offered a polite bow. Luke was completely taken aback. Barbarians don't bow. They don't lower their heads for anyone. Their whole culture is built around strength and pride. This one was already shattering every expectation. Luke figured that perhaps this barbarian had learned a thing or two on his travels and kindly invited him to sit down. Kettle took a seat across from him, his eyes scanning the richly decorated room with fascination. He said without any filter that being inside a noble's castle was just incredible. He'd always been a huge fan of castles, and this one was beyond anything he'd imagined. His eyes then locked onto the knight standing beside Luke. He absolutely lit up, gushing that he used to play night games as a kid, and that seeing a real-life knight like this felt like a dream come true. The knight just narrowed his eyes, but to the knight, that look wasn't admiration at all. It was pure, unadulterated killing intent. He bristled, thinking this guy had made a huge mistake bringing that kind of vibe in front of a lord. In his mind, Kettle definitely wasn't walking out of here alive. Luke, completely unfazed, kicked off the questioning. He explained that the reason he'd called Kettle in was pretty straightforward. He just had a few things to confirm, and then Kettle would be free to go. Kettle just smiled and said he was all ears ready for whatever he wanted to ask. Luke's first question was simple. Where was Kettle from Kettle called it a meaningful question and gave a crystal clear answer. He said he came from the coldest place in the world, a land completely covered in white. At that, Luke and the knight shot each other a look. They immediately knew what he was talking about, the white snowfield. And if that was actually true, then the man standing in front of them was the legendary barbarian. Luke had to admit that was a pretty tall tale to swallow. Kettle just replied that the place he described was a miserable dump, and whether they believed him or not was totally up to them. Luke gave a slow nod and switched gears with his next question. He said where Kettle came from didn't really matter as much as his strength. Just how powerful was Kettle, really? Kettle looked him straight in the eye and said, "That's the wrong question to ask. Because I have no idea how you measure strength in this world. Not yet, anyway." Luke leaned back in his chair, his eyes flicking over to his knight, and a silent message seemed to pass between them. Then turning back to Kettle, he proposed a little sparring match against his knight, even promising a pretty generous reward for his trouble. He made it clear it wouldn't be a fight to the death, just a friendly test of skill. He added that he trusted Kettle could keep things under control. Kettle just laughed, sounding absolutely thrilled and excited. Luke couldn't help but raise an eyebrow at that reaction. Most people would be a little nervous or at least concerned about having to fight a trained knight. But Kettle, he was grinning from ear to ear. To him, getting the chance to spar with a knight, an actual real-deal knight from a fantasy world who could use an aura and cool skills, was the most exciting thing ever. This wasn't just a fight, it was a chance to see a legend in action and maybe learn a thing or two. Luke, on the other hand, tightened his grip on his armrest, feeling uneasy. It was always the same with these barbarians, he thought. No matter how civilized they tried to act, you could never hide that primal love for a good scrap. A wave of discomfort washed over him as the group headed over to the Colosseum. From his seat up in the stands, Luke watched as Kettle and the knight stared each other down. He muttered under his breath that he really hoped no blood would be spilled today. The signal was given, and the knight, puffed up with arrogant authority, started talking. He declared that Kettle should feel honored just to witness his blade in action. Kettle's simple reply, he was just genuinely excited. That casual attitude just ticked the knight off even more. He charged forward, instantly activating his aura. A green light swirled around him, his whole body glowing with concentrated energy. In one fluid motion, he lunged straight for Kettle, projecting 3 phantom blades from his sword, all of them aimed right at the barbarian's head and Kettle. He dodged it like it was nothing. He even said out loud, "Wow, there really are 3 of them, and they're all real, not just illusions." He sounded pretty amused by the whole thing, and he asked if this neat little trick was what the knight called swordsmanship. The knight just clicked his tongue, clearly not impressed. He shot back that, while Kettle was surprisingly good at dodging, he obviously had no way to fight back. And with that, he charged in again. Feeling pretty sure this was about wrapped up, Kettle casually lifted a hand, and with a simple flick of his finger, the knight's sword just shattered into pieces. The poor knight didn't even have a second to process that before Kettle's hand was flat against his chest, followed by a slow, almost lazy pressure. He simply made a fist, and the knight's armor crumpled up like a piece of scrap paper. In the very next moment, he sent the guy flying backward, which sent him flying into a wall with a massive crash. The very ground ripped apart as he slid to a halt. Luke's jaw just about hit the floor. His best knight, a seriously top-tier fighter, was taken apart in a single move. The whole arena was a... Luke's jaw just about hit the floor. His best knight, a seriously top-tier fighter, was taken apart in a single move. The whole arena was a mess from that one hit. I mean, there was a busted wall, a crater in the floor, and his knight just lying there in a crumpled pile. Then Kettle just turns to Luke and casually asks, "So are we done here?" Luke could barely even speak. He managed a little nod and choked out a yes, but on the inside, he was totally freaking out. A guy who can do all that in one hit, he had to be superhuman, and that was putting it mildly. There was no telling what his real power level was. If a guy like that was left to his own devices, he could seriously throw the whole world out of whack. Right then and there, Luke decided he needed to report this to someone who could actually handle this kind of crazy power. A real, honest-to-goodness Swordmaster. He muttered out loud that Kane, one of the only guys who fit the bill, should be showing up pretty soon. Maybe this whole situation would get his attention. Later, back in his room, Luke's frantic thoughts were cut short by a voice. It was Kane himself casually asking, "You talking about me?" Luke whipped around to the open window, and sure enough, there was the old man just standing there. He let out a big sigh and said, "You know your habit of sneaking in through windows is as charming as ever." Kane just grinned and said, "Hey, a guy's got to have some fun." Then he asked, "So are you going to tell me about this interesting thing now, or what?" Luke quickly stood up to greet him, properly calling him Lord Kane and thanking him for coming on such short notice. Meanwhile, back in the infirmary, the knight was starting to wake up. His clothes were shredded and his armor was in a million pieces. But somehow, he didn't have a single scratch on him. Luke walked in and asked how he was feeling, and the knight immediately apologized for failing. Kane, who was standing nearby, chimed in that it was his fault for letting his foolish student fight an opponent he was no match for. Kane took a closer look at the knight and commented, sounding pretty surprised that he didn't have any injuries at all. No broken bones. Not even a bruise. His armor was completely destroyed. But the guy himself was perfectly fine. That could only mean one thing. That barbarian was holding back. He wasn't just some mindless brute. He had perfect control over his incredible power. That kind of precision mixed with that much raw strength is almost unheard of. Kane declared that the barbarian's power was way beyond a normal knight's level. He was at the very least superhuman. Luke and the knight just stared at each other, totally shocked. Luke paused for a second, then kind of sheepishly asked how Kettle's power stacked up against Kane's. Kane answered without a hint of doubt. "Look, the barbarian might be strong, incredibly strong even, but I'm a swordmaster. Being superhuman isn't enough to beat me." Luke let out a nervous laugh, relieved to hear that. But then Kane added something that made him worry again. He said that as far as he could tell, Kettle hadn't even used his aura. Causing that much destruction without any aura, that's just insane. He wondered out loud if this was just what it meant to be one of those barbarians from the White Wasteland. Luke admitted that he didn't really buy it at first, but now he was a total believer. Kettle had to be the legendary barbarian everyone talks about. Kane was thinking about the story he'd heard. It was about a lone man from the frozen north who was supposedly more beast than human, a monster in a man's skin. He almost bought it for a second, but then he reconsidered. If Kettle really were a monster, why would he have spared that night? Why show any mercy at all? He figured he must be wrong. And when Luke asked what he was thinking, Kane just brushed it off, saying it was nothing important. He had other matters he was sent to handle, and a bunch of strange requests from the Emperor were starting to pile up. Luke simply nodded, accepting that. Cain then asked if Kettle was still in the city, and Luke replied that he was pretty sure he was. Kettle had mentioned he was planning to stick around for a while. Hearing this, Cain turned and declared that he would go meet this barbarian himself. Meanwhile, the first captain was having a chat with Kettle, asking him what his next move was. Kettle admitted that he hadn't really decided yet. While he was grateful for the reward Luke had given him, he felt like just wandering from one place to another. Clearing dungeons would get old really fast. The captain explained that he basically had two ways to move forward from here. He could either find someone important to act as his sponsor and vouch for him, or he could become a mercenary. Kettle asked him to explain, so the captain laid it out. Mercenaries could earn official recognition and status after they proved themselves with enough successful missions. But until they hit that milestone, they were basically just considered disposable grunts. He added with a knowing look that he'd been one himself back in the day. He then said that given Kettle's incredible strength, getting a sponsor would be a whole lot easier. Kettle was surprised that was even an option. The captain confirmed that mercenaries were monster hunters, errand boys, and everything in between. Sponsorship, though, was a shortcut if he could get someone powerful enough to back him. Kettle wanted to hear more about the other option, so the captain reiterated that he could become a mercenary. He explained that if Kettle built up a good track record and got recognition from the guild, his status could be officially acknowledged. But he warned that unless a mercenary reaches a certain rank, they're basically treated like common errand boys. He added that when he was a mercenary himself, it was the exact same deal. He told Kettle that with his power, finding a sponsor was probably the easier route, but becoming a mercenary was still a totally valid path. Kettle looked amazed that a job like that even existed. He said that being a mercenary, someone who takes quests to hunt monsters, sounded like something straight out of a fantasy story. That settled it. He asked where he needed to go to become one. The captain told him there was a guild hall, and Kettle immediately asked if he'd be kind enough to show him the way. The knight captain, seeming a bit curious as to why he'd want to be a merc, agreed, saying he didn't mind. As they walked, he explained that mercenaries are known for roaming the world, taking on all sorts of requests, and some people romanticize that kind of life. But the reality of it is far less glamorous. Mercenaries without any recognized status are stuck at the very bottom of the social ladder. Even the ones with a decent reputation often end up dead, trying to clear some uncharted dungeon. They're often treated as cannon fodder, used for all the dirtiest jobs imaginable. That's why the lower levels of the mercenary world are so grimy, shameless, and loud. Right on cue, inside the mercenary guild hall, a guy gets socked right in the face and crashes to the floor. Meanwhile, everyone else is just watching the show, even starting to place bets. Over at the reception desk, a woman just lets out this long, tired sigh as the chaos keeps going. One of her coworkers calls over asking how the batch of new recruits is shaping up today. Her name is Rosa, and she just replies that it's awful, a total bunch of weirdos. She complains that one guy is some kind of nut job claiming he's a paladin. The rest of them are rogues, and even the nun, who looks normal enough at first glance, is getting the side eye because of the god she worships. Rosa sounds completely over it. Her coworker just replies, "Well, that's a bummer." Rosa just goes on complaining that not one single decent person has walked through that door all day. She gripes about how these muscle-headed mercs are constantly starting fights and then sighs dramatically, wishing a handsome prince on a white horse would just swoop in and save her from this boring desk job. And right on cue, the door swings open. Rosa's eyes immediately light up as she looks up full of hope, and that's when she sees Kettle walking in. Kettle strolls in and asks if this is the guild hall. The guy in the middle of a brawl freezes, and suddenly every head in the room turns. A wave of whispers spreads through the crowd, all wondering if a real-life barbarian just walked into the mercenary guild. Kettle, on the other hand, looks absolutely delighted to be there. He announces that he's here to become a mercenary. Rosa, looking a little freaked out, asks him why he'd want to do that. He explains that he has a few reasons, but the main one is that he heard being a mercenary is a good way to get his status officially recognized. Rosa confirms that's right, but she warns him that to make that happen, he's going to need to rack up a ton of accomplishments first. She asks if he's cool with that, and he just cheerfully says he is. So she tells him the registration fee is 5 copper coins and asks for his name and age. Kettle tells her his name, but admits he's not actually sure how old he is. She just brushes it off and says she'll put down something that looks about right. With that, she hands him his registration form and a brand new mercenary badge. She explains that it represents his status and warns him not to lose it. Kettle looks down at the badge, picks it up, and his eyes just light up like a little kid on Christmas morning. He immediately asks what kind of jobs are available and if he can grab one right away. Rosa politely corrects him, explaining that they're called requests, not jobs. She then hands him a list of the requests he's currently eligible for. He glances at it and asks, "Is this really it?" Herb gathering, basement, cleaning, sewer cleaning, street cleaning, and night patrol. She explains that since he's an F-rank mercenary, those are pretty much the only kinds of requests he can take for now. She carefully adds that she's heard barbarians are a proud bunch and was worried he might be offended. But she explains that if he starts with these simple tasks and builds up a good track record, he'll eventually be able to take on more challenging quests. He just says, "I'll take this one," and points right to herb gathering. A little surprised, she asks if he's sure. He nods and says, "Yep, that's the one, I'm good with it." Then he asks where he needs to go to find the herbs. She tells him the spot is just outside the village and shows him a little drawing of what the herbs look like. He says he's heading out now, and she just says, "Okay." Rosa is clearly a bit taken aback by how chill he is about everything, and just like that, he's gone. Her coworker, meanwhile, is totally freaking out. As for Kettle, he just makes his way into the woods. He quickly finds the herbs that match the drawing, noting that they're good for treating wounds, but look a little strange. Then he pulls off his shirt, mentions he packed some sun protection gear, and then cheerfully announces that it's time for his very first job as a mercenary. About an hour passes, and he comes back with a massive bag stuffed with herbs, cheerfully asking if he got enough. Rosa jokes that he brought back a ton and wonders if he's secretly trying to wipe out the entire herb field. But then she spots something unusual. Every single herb is in perfect shape. Most mercenaries just yank them out of the ground like animals, which totally wrecks their value. Kettle admits he might not look the part, but he's pretty proud of his gentle touch. Rosa just nods, gets it, and thanks him for doing such a great job. She hands over his payment for the job, a single silver coin. It's barely enough to get the cheapest thing on the menu, but for Kettle, it's the very first coin he's ever earned through honest labor, and he's absolutely thrilled about it. Without missing a beat, he asks for another job. Rosa is just baffled by his attitude, especially coming from a barbarian. Kettle points out that there's still plenty of daylight left, so he wants to knock out as many tasks as he can. Rosa just watches him go, completely puzzled by how happy he seems, and quietly decides that, yep, this new guy is definitely a total weirdo. Kettle proudly announces he's taking on the next quest, which happens to be cleaning a warehouse. Though a quick glance at the request board shows he's already checked off a few others. Rosa mentions that after the herb gathering, this is actually the third cleaning job he's picked. She wonders out loud if maybe he has some kind of cleaning obsession. She just tells him, hey, if he enjoys it that much, he should knock himself out. So Kettle heads over to the warehouse and walks in. A woman inside looks up, totally startled, and he just tells her he's there for the cleaning job. She immediately starts to freak out, so he asks if she's the owner. She says yes, but then immediately asks what in the world a barbarian is doing standing in her warehouse. He later recalls that the warehouse cleaning was pretty simple. Didn't even have to move any heavy stuff. After that, he decided to take on street cleaning. He just grabbed a broom and got to sweeping. It was a little tough, controlling his strength at first, but after some serious concentration, he managed to sweep without completely shattering the broom or the sidewalk. And of course, someone is watching him. It's Kane wearing a totally ridiculous disguise, spying on him from around a corner, muttering to himself, totally confused by what he's seeing. Kane knows exactly who this man is. Kettle, he knows the guy has enough power to literally shake a kingdom. If people knew who he really was, he'd be shown nothing but respect and fear everywhere he went. And yet here he is, this absolute force of nature, doing chores like they're the most important thing in the world. Kane just stares, completely unable to wrap his head around why someone like Kettle would choose to live like this. But Kettle couldn't care less. He's totally lost in his work. The next morning comes complete with chirping birds, and he starts to wake up. As he sits up, his gaze falls on a little pouch on his nightstand. It's his pay from yesterday's jobs. Turns out Rosa had dropped it off. She told him he did an amazing job on his first day as a mercenary, and paid him for finishing all 15 of the tasks he took on. Each one got him 1 silver coin for a grand total of 15 silver coins. He thanks her warmly and promises he'll be back tomorrow. Then he declares that it's time to start his second day in civilization. Meanwhile, a kid is crying his eyes out in the street while a bunch of worried people gather around. Kettle just strolls by calmly, then pauses when he sees a building with a sign that says library. He walks right in. The woman at the front desk greets him looking super nervous. He just asks if it's okay for him to read some of the books. She's clearly intimidated, but nods yes. Once he's inside, he starts pulling books off the shelves and flipping through them one by one. The librarian is just frozen, completely baffled. Meanwhile, Kane is lurking nearby, even though no one can see him. He gets the gist of what's happening and is just as flabbergasted. A barbarian reading books. This just doesn't compute with his entire worldview. He starts to wonder, do the people from the White Snowfield have some secret book club culture we don't know about? Or maybe Kettle is just a one-of-a-kind oddball. Snapping a book shut, Kettle casually mentions that the Empire came out on top in the end. He remembers how a few years back this woman, Molina, showed up in the snowfield offering to sell weapons to whoever wanted them, be it the kingdom or the Empire. And apparently, the Empire won that bidding war. Now, they're ridiculously powerful, and the Vorin Kingdom is pretty much just their puppet. The Empire has already swallowed up half of the human world, and they just keep growing like they're trying to take over absolutely everything. Kettle thinks about all their victories for a second, then just shakes his head. All right, that's enough human history for one day, he thinks. He eagerly flips to a new section, wanting to learn about the non-human races, and says, there's got to be some amazing stuff in here. He dives into a section about Mentia, the dwarven cave that's just overflowing with rare ores. Then he reads about Parapia, the hidden village of the fairies, Leg Maria, the floating city of the Celestials, and Marselia, the super-secret sanctuary of the elves, a place so well hidden that even the most powerful rulers have never managed to find it. Kettle remarks that, hey, maybe he's finally strong enough to go looking for it, but then his expression shifts as a deeper thought hits him. He starts reading about places like his home, the White Snowfield, and the Demon Zones, huge dangerous lands where humans just can't survive. Turns out there are 5 of these zones. There's the Silent Forest, where everything just goes quiet, and the Abyss, which is trying to drag the whole world into darkness. There's also the Deep Sea, where even land dwellers can somehow breathe and live, and the Hollowing Pit, which is just a place of pure empty nothingness. And last but not least, his own home, the White Snowfield. These regions are home to terrifying monsters they call aberrations. But for some reason, these monsters never venture into the human world. Kettle just sits there for a moment thinking about how massive the world really is. The White Snowfield alone is enormous, and it's just one tiny piece of the puzzle. He figures that's about all the useful info this library has for him. He thanks the librarian for letting him use the books, and she just nods and says it was no problem at all. With that, Kettle heads out and makes a beeline for the Mercenary Guild. He walks right up to Rosa and asks what kind of jobs are on the board for today. She's a little startled by him just popping up like that, but she hands over the request forms. You can see the excitement practically radiating off of him. Watching from a distance, Kane mutters to himself that Kettle is absolutely nuts. He decides it's time to face him head on. Later that evening, as Kettle is walking home, he's talking to himself, mentioning he knocked out about 12 more jobs today. He figures even the small ones start to add up. And honestly, the work feels pretty rewarding. At this rate, he figures it won't be long before everyone sees him as a real-deal mercenary. Right on cue, Kane steps out from around a corner. Kettle spots him instantly and is like, hey, what can I do for you? Kane just gives him a silent, intense glare. Kettle then casually says he knew he was being followed all day. Kane is completely floored. He'd been hiding his presence perfectly. There's no way anyone should have been able to sense him, not even the sharpest person alive. Kettle sizes him up and wonders out loud if he's a mugger, quickly clutching his coin pouch for safety. Kane just stares totally dumbfounded by the accusation. Kettle then announces that since Kane's not saying anything, he must be right. He adds that even in a town with pretty good security, you can never be too careful. Kane grumbles that there are still bandits lurking around. He tries to protest, muttering something about being a Swordmaster, though he's pretty sure no one would actually believe him. Kettle just shakes his head and calls it pathetic stooping to robbery at his age. He even remarks that the economy must be in worse shape than he thought. It then occurs to him that taking down Kane and turning him in would be a nice little addition to his growing mercenary record. Kane is completely floored by Kettle's assumption that he's a bandit, but he has to admit this could actually work in his favor. If Kettle really thinks that, then fighting him head-on is the perfect way to gauge his strength and figure out who he really is. As Kettle starts walking toward him, Kane feels a small flicker of unease in his chest. Then, without any warning, Kettle's body starts to sway, and in the blink of an eye, he just vanishes. Kane blinks, confused, trying to make sense of what just happened. Before he can even react, Kettle reappears just inches from his face, his hand lunging forward. Kane knows immediately. that if he freezes up, Kettle's going to snatch him by the back of the neck. He barely manages to twist out of the way. Kettle steps back looking intrigued. He says that wasn't half bad, clearly impressed with Kane's speedy reaction. Kane fires back that he wasn't even close to getting caught, but deep down he knows it was an incredibly close call. He admits to himself that if his reflexes were just a fraction of a second slower, he would have been caught. But what's really unsettling him is the complete absence of any aura. Kettle moved with inhuman speed, and yet there was no energy signature to be found. Now this is interesting, Kettle declares. Kane can hardly wrap his head around it. This level of speed, this kind of pressure, all coming from a purely physical body. He tells himself to forget about testing him and just get ready for a real fight, taking a sharp breath. He charges forward, shouting that he's going all out. Kettle braces himself and then disappears once more. Before Kane can even process it, a hand clamps down hard on his arm. Kane says out loud that even with his perception fully expanded, he couldn't react. Kettle begins to twist his wrist, and Kane grits his teeth against the searing pain. He feels like his arm is being jammed into solid stone as his entire body gets dragged along against his will. The pain shoots up his arm as he cries out, demanding to know what kind of monster could have this kind of strength. He declares that this is no contest when it comes to raw power. And if that's the case, there's only one thing left to do: unleash everything. Kane begins to release his aura, as a deep green energy erupts from within him. Kettle notices right away as the mana radiates outward, looking genuinely taken aback. The aura explodes in a brilliant wave of green light, forcing Kane to step back. Kettle, on the other hand, stands his ground, holding a handful of the aura as if it was nothing more than smoke. Kane stares, readying himself to fight again. Kettle just remarks that bandits these days have all sorts of tricks. Kane is absolutely speechless. He seriously still thinks he's a bandit. He tries to explain that what Kettle just saw was a mana manifestation, a technique that only the most elite fighters can pull off. He adds that he's cloaked his entire body in it, which is something no common bandit could possibly do. And he absolutely cannot believe Kettle is still treating this whole thing like some petty mugging. Kane thinks back on what just happened. He hadn't meant to, but he had reflexively unleashed his mana at full power. A manifested aura like that is more than capable of slicing clean through steel. Any regular person would have been shredded just by making contact, but Kettle he was just standing there, completely fine. Kane wondered what kind of monster could take a direct hit from manifested aura without any defenses up. Meanwhile, Kettle, totally unbothered, mentioned that he had no clue what kind of trick Kane just used, but said it was time to wrap things up. Kane went for his sword, but stopped dead in his tracks. Kettle was already in his face, blocking the sword with a single finger. Kane grunted, putting every last bit of his strength into it, but it was no use. The blade wouldn't move an inch. He could only stare in shock as the hilt started to warp under the pressure of that one finger. A wave of dread washed over him. This was really, really bad. Kettle's arm shot out once more. Kane saw it coming, and a lone tear traced a path down his cheek. He whispered that this was probably it for him. A little while later, Kettle was casually walking through town, with Kane tossed over his shoulder like a bag of spuds. He commented out loud that the fight was actually a lot of fun, and he was surprised that a simple bandit knew such fancy moves. Eventually, he made his way to the city guard post. The captain on duty just stared, completely dumbfounded by what he was seeing. Kettle nonchalantly held Kane up by the scruff of his shirt, presenting him like a prize catch. The captain sputtered, asking what in the world was going on and why on earth Kane was here. He frantically asked if Kettle had attacked him, just trying to piece it all together. Kettle just stated the obvious: he'd caught a bandit. The captain was left speechless. Kettle then asked if turning him in would go on his mercenary record, for the credit. The captain was just too flabbergasted to give a proper answer. His mind was racing. That was Sir Kane, the one and only Swordmaster of the kingdom, a man who had reached the absolute peak of human potential. And there he was, dangling like a common criminal, taken down in broad daylight by some barbarian-looking dude. He finally managed to tell Kettle that Kane was no bandit. Kettle just raised an eyebrow and asked if the captain knew the guy. He then asked if maybe the captain was his partner in crime. The captain immediately snapped to attention, bowing with the deepest respect, and declared that he was paying his respects to the Swordmaster, the kingdom's one and only. Kettle just blinked, totally lost. Kane, meanwhile, was staring intently at the floor, refusing to look at anyone. Kettle just shook his head, saying none of this made any sense. Why would a big-shot Swordmaster be sneaking around like a petty thief? He was adamant that Kane had tried to swipe his silver coins. The captain swore that it was the real Swordmaster, saying he could never mistake that face. Kettle then mused out loud, wondering if maybe Kane was a mage using some kind of illusion spell. The captain pointed out that if there was a mage powerful enough to perfectly imitate Kane, they would be just as famous as the Swordmaster. So Kettle asked if Swordmaster was just a fancy word for bandit. The captain, completely exasperated, asked what on earth he was talking about. An incredibly awkward silence filled the room. Finally, Kettle asked one more time if Kane was really truly a Swordmaster. The captain confirmed it, and for the first time, Kettle looked genuinely shocked. The captain announced that he needed to report this to the Lord right away. The scene cuts to Lord Luke slamming his fists on his desk in pure disbelief, shouting, demanding to know if it was true that Sir Kane had actually been defeated. Later on, a very apologetic Kettle admitted that he probably should have let Kane explain himself. But Kane just replied that the fault was his own for not speaking up. An uncomfortable silence falls between them as Luke tries to wrap his head around it all. He was totally expecting Kane to challenge the barbarian to a proper duel, so as not to get completely stomped. He doesn't know the play-by-play, but from the looks of it, it was a clear-cut loss. Which means this barbarian is somehow stronger than the kingdom's one and only Swordmaster. This gets him thinking about the power rankings of superhumans. Kane only just reached that level, so he's probably still on the lower end of the spectrum. Still, being a Swordmaster is one of the most respected titles in the entire realm, and Kettle beat him. Luke lets out a heavy sigh and mutters that his head is starting to throb. He figures there's obviously been a huge misunderstanding and decides it's time to make his exit. He tells the two of them that they should probably sit down and talk things out. Then, he's out the door, closing it behind him, leaving Kettle just staring. Kane starts to break out in a nervous sweat. He admits to himself that this is beyond humiliating. The defeat wasn't just bad. It was a flawless victory for the other guy. His pride is in absolute tatters. He sets his teacup down, trying to gather what little composure he has left. Then, with as much dignity as he can muster, he formally introduces himself. Kettle asks if Swordmaster is his actual last name. Kane explains that once you reach his level, surnames don't really matter anymore. Kettle nods, intrigued. He then asks about the special technique Kane used earlier. Kane is a little surprised that he's interested, and summons a small swirl of aura in his hand, asking if this is what he's talking about. Kettle's face completely lights up, saying that at first he just thought it was some cheap bandit trick, but now that he knows it's a real Swordmaster ability, he's dying to learn more. Kane explains that it's called aura, the physical manifestation of the arcane. Kettle is absolutely buzzing with excitement, finally getting to see some real arcane energy up close in this fantasy world. He immediately asks if Kane can teach him how to use it. Kane replies that to create an aura, you have to be able to control the arcane directly. Kettle asks if the arcane is basically the same thing as mana. Kane explains that the arcane is the raw energy itself. If you shape it into an aura, you become a swordsman. If you channel it as mana, you become a mage. Kettle finds this whole concept fascinating. He asks again if Kane would be willing to teach him, humbly admitting that he's still lacking in a lot of areas and is trying to improve. He even says, please. Kane agrees, but you can see him hesitate. He asks if Kettle really needs his help. After all, he's clearly the stronger of the two. Kettle says he doesn't know the first thing about aura or real swordsmanship, and that up to now he's just been swinging wildly. Kane asks if he's being serious. But then he gets a grip on himself. He affirms that he is a swordmaster, and even though he lost, he never even drew his weapon. He resolves to teach this barbarian the way of the sword and use this as a chance to reclaim his shattered pride. He declares that without his sword, he's only half a man anyway. Kettle says that he kind of figured as much, and that Kane's weakness during their scuffle makes a lot more sense now, seeing as how he never pulled out his blade. Kane, looking a bit deflated, admits that's pretty much what happened. Kettle continues saying that it felt a little off to hear someone at Kane's current power level being called a swordmaster, but figures that if he had actually drawn his blade, he might have had a shot at winning. Kane, however, isn't entirely sold on that idea. While Kettle is visibly pumped to start their lesson, Kane can't help but have a little internal monologue, wondering if this training is just going to completely destroy what little confidence he has left. He worries that the more he teaches Kettle, the more of an insecure mess he's going to become. Kettle then tells him that before arriving in this kingdom, he'd learned some sword skills before, sure, but what he was seeing now was on a whole other level. This was the real deal fantasy-level swordsmanship that used arcane aura in ways his old training couldn't even dream of. And that's exactly the kind of power he was dying to learn. Kane explained that his special style was all about turning illusions into reality. He then asked Kettle if he happened to notice that when he was fighting his student. Kettle admitted he didn't realize that Knight was Kane's disciple, but now that he brought it up, he totally remembered the guy's sword splitting into 3, and all 3 of them were solid. He mused out loud, wondering if this whole embodiment thing was more about skill than just raw power. Kane confirmed that was exactly right. He went on to explain that true swordsmanship is about merging the blade and your aura. It's an art that, once you master it, lets you command the arcane itself, and at the very peak of that journey, that's where you find the Swordmaster. As he was talking, Kane drew his sword and started channeling aura into it, and Kettle was just watching, with his eyes wide, totally captivated. He couldn't help but exclaim that it looked incredible. Kane agreed, even though he was still trying to wrap his own head around what he was about to do. He figured if he was really going to teach this so-called barbarian the art of swordsmanship, he might as well go all in. He added that the whole turning illusions into reality thing might sound a little confusing, so he'd just show him instead. Taking a deep breath, Kane got into position and swung his sword, the blade glowing with a powerful aura. The sheer force of the swing shattered the ground beneath him, and then the attack itself split into 5 different arcs of energy, which shot across the room, leaving a trail of destruction behind them. Kettle was completely blown away. The attack multiplied itself 5 times, hitting the walls on the other side of the room with terrifying accuracy. Kane then explained that lots of techniques use aura to make illusions, but his style took it one step further. He actually gave those illusions physical form. Kettle repeated the name of the technique, admitting that he was seriously impressed. Kane, feeling pretty proud of himself, asked if Kettle was amazed, but Kettle's response was not at all what he expected. He just casually said, "Yeah, I feel like I could probably do that too." Kane just blinked, totally floored by the nerve of this guy. He practically shouted, asking what kind of crazy talk that was. He'd spent his whole life training to get to this point. It took a combination of rare talent and brutal discipline to reach his level. There was just no way someone could copy that kind of mastery after seeing it just one time. But Kettle just shrugged and said it would be easier to show him than to explain. He stepped to the side, picked something up, and it wasn't a sword. It was an axe. He adjusted his grip, planted his feet, and hoisted the axe over his shoulder. And then he swung. It wasn't elegant, and it definitely didn't have the same refined aura control that Kane had, but you couldn't argue with the results. Several waves of force shot out, perfectly matching the pattern of Kane's attack. A massive explosion followed, shaking the whole room. Smoke was literally rising from the axe. Kettle just looked over at Kane and asked, "So how was that?" Kane had to admit that, yeah, it looked like his technique, but the similarity was all because of raw speed and insane strength, not actual skill. He confessed that for a second he was actually tricked, but in the end it was just a display of brute force. Kettle just pointed out that in a real fight, the result is all that matters. If the effect is the same, doesn't that mean something? Kane thought about that for a moment and had to begrudgingly agree. He admitted it was pretty hard to argue with that logic, even if it totally crushed his ego. He then challenges Kettle, saying if he really thinks he can copy anything, he should try and replicate this next move. Kane gets into position once again, but this time, instead of pouring his aura into the sword, he channels it directly into his own body. Then in a sudden flash, several after images of Kane split off from his body surrounding the area. A wave of condensed aura shoots out from the center, exploding in a massive blast. So much for a quiet day at the training grounds, I guess. Kane explains that this is a bodily separation technique, something only achievable through perfect aura control, and smugly asks if Kettle can copy this one too. Kettle takes a few steps back, tightens his grip on his axe, and focuses. Slowly but surely, shadowy figures start to separate from his form. They were clones made entirely of swirling purple aura. Then with a mighty roar, the clones burst outward, creating a vortex of pure violent energy that just shreds the entire area. Seeing this, Kane just collapses to his knees, his face crumples up, and he just starts bawling. Through his sobs, Kane wails that what Kettle just did was the ultimate technique. He'd spent his entire life perfecting, and the guy copied it in mere seconds. He just can't believe his life's dedication to swordsmanship could feel so completely worthless. The emotional damage is so real, he starts clutching his chest like he's having a heart attack. Kettle, completely unfazed by this display, remarks that Kane's mind is as fragile as toilet paper if he were to use it. He'd probably poke a hole through it on the first wipe. Still, he tells Kane with all sincerity that his swordsmanship is actually incredible. Kane looks up, confused. Kettle clarifies that his own move was just a really, really fast swing, nothing more. The technique Kane showed off, though, that was the real deal. Something that Kettle himself can't actually do. He admits he hasn't reached that level of arcane mastery yet. Kane manages to steady his breathing, blinking away the last of his tears. He nods, agreeing that Kettle is right. His swordsmanship isn't worthless after all. He just has to accept that the problem isn't his technique. It's that Kettle is a complete and utter freak of nature. He can't help but wonder, what kind of monster can move so fast he becomes a blur, all without using a single shred of aura? That's something no normal human should be able to do. Kettle then asks if Kane would be willing to teach him what technique truly means. Kane takes a deep breath, realizing he let his emotions get the better of him, and apologizes. He explains that to use a true technique, a person first has to master aura control. But aura control is only possible after you understand the arcane. He goes on to explain that no mage, swordsman, or witch can ever reach the highest levels of power without awakening their arcane. The only exception to this rule, he says, are those who serve divine beings. Kettle asks if divine power is something totally different, and Kane confirms that it is. He explains that miracles from the gods don't rely on a person's own ability, but solely on the will of the divine. Kettle listens, taking it all in. Kane tells him that arcane power is the mystery hidden within yourself. How a person decides to wield that power is what defines everything. So if Kettle wants to use aura, manipulate mana, or even command spirits, it all starts with understanding the arcane. He then breaks down the arcane into 5 distinct stages. The most fundamental of these is called arcane perception, which is the ability to sense, awaken, and recognize arcane energy. Kettle chimes in, asking if just anyone can sense it, but Kane just shakes his head. Without natural talent, a person can't even feel it. Those who are able to perceive the arcane are classified as third class. Kane continues explaining that the ability to interact with the arcane is divided into 5 different classes, and being third class is just the starting point. As he hears this, Kettle's eyes narrow as a memory comes back to him. He remembers Milena mentioning something just like this about 5 years ago, realizing this arcane classification system must be what she was talking about. Kane explains that the ranking system for arcane users isn't super strict. It's more like a general guideline. The power difference between people in the same class can be massive, and the lines separating the levels are pretty blurry. He emphasizes that he just needs Kettle to understand the basic concept. Kettle nods, saying he's got it. With that, Kane says it's time to get started. The very first step, he declares, is arcane perception. Kane tells Kettle to try and feel everything around him, not just with his body, but with a kind of sixth sense reaching beyond the physical world. He needs to awaken a dormant sense he's never used, telling him to notice the breeze on his skin and the pressure of the earth under him. Kane even tells him to feel the currents flowing through the air, promising that somewhere in that awareness he'll find a presence like no other. So our boy Kettle gives it a try. He sits down, closes his eyes, and concentrates as hard as he can. A few moments later, he pops his eyes open and bluntly states that he can't feel a single thing. Kane just stares at him dumbfounded. He was totally caught off guard by that response. He really wasn't expecting it, and asks if Kettle is absolutely sure. After all, someone with his incredible physical strength should be able to sense at least a tiny spark. Even some people with 0 mana can feel it. But he has to admit maybe Kettle is just a special exception. He wonders if it has something to do with being raised in the White Wasteland. Kane admits that the barbarians from that region are always full of surprises. Kettle just says he wouldn't know. He's never even heard anyone talk about the arcane where he grew up. Most folks there don't exactly do a lot of deep thinking. Kane reassures him that sensing the arcane is tough even for pros, so he suggests they try a more direct approach. He's going to channel his aura into Kettle to try and jumpstart the arcane pathway. Kettle's eyes light up as he asks if Kane is going to give him some aura. Kane says it's something like that and tells him to brace himself. He instructs Kettle to just relax. Then he tells him to center his mind and focus inward so he can feel the flow of energy Kane's about to pump into him. But the second Kane places a hand on Kettle, he's completely stunned. He mutters to himself that Kettle's body's just plain weird. It literally feels like touching a rock carving. The muscle density alone is totally inhuman. Kane starts to seriously question if this guy's even human. Kettle notices the long pause and asks if something's wrong. Kane quickly snaps out of his daze and says he's ready to go. He explains that the key to unlocking the arcane is to find the internal channel where aura naturally flows. That's their mission. The goal is to awaken that path. But as he starts the process, Kane immediately feels that something is way off. He tries again and again. He sends waves of aura into Kettle's body but gets nothing. It feels like he's wading through an endless void, trying to grab something that isn't there. The deeper he pushes his aura, the more he feels a crushing, overwhelming resistance. Finally, he pulls his hand back, saying, "It's no use." Kettle blinks confused and asks if this means he just doesn't have the talent for it. Kane quickly shoots that idea down, insisting it's not about talent. The problem is that his aura can't penetrate deep enough into Kettle's body. To awaken the arcane, the energy has to reach something way down deep inside, and in Kettle's case, it's like hitting a brick wall. It just can't get there. Kettle asks if he's saying that the arcane path just doesn't exist inside him. Kane says it's not that simple. He couldn't even get deep enough to check if it's there or not. Kettle presses for more details, asking, "What does that mean?" Kane explains that his body is just unnatural. Its density. The way it's constructed, it's just not compatible with the standard way aura flows. It's like trying to pour light into a black hole. The aura doesn't travel. It just gets swallowed up. He theorizes that Kettle's sheer physical power might be interfering with the whole process. Kettle lets out a sigh and asks if that means not even a Swordmaster can help him unlock his aura. Kane hesitates, then admits he really isn't sure. This is something completely beyond anything he's ever seen before. He advises Kettle to try and find a Swordmaster who specializes in aura, or maybe even visit the Mage's Tower for a proper evaluation. In any case, he apologizes for not being able to help. Kettle just shrugs it off, saying it's all right. Just knowing there's still a chance is more than enough for him. He gets up and thanks Kane, telling him he learned a great deal. Kane is left behind, lost in thought. Every barbarian he had ever met was basically a wild animal, always drunk, violent, and obsessed with causing destruction. Society had no use for them, but this Kettle, is completely different. He turns to Kettle and asks if he would ever consider joining the kingdom. Kettle asks him to clarify what he means. Kane explains that he wants him to pledge his loyalty and receive a formal rank. With his incredible strength, he could rise through the ranks in no time, and Kane himself would personally sponsor him. Kettle says it's a fascinating offer, but he has to decline. He just values his freedom far too much. Kane realizes with a hint of regret that if they had someone like Kettle on their side, they could possibly even start to shake off the Empire's tight grip. Kane tries one more time, asking if even a noble title could tempt him. He points out that it's not an offer he makes lightly. Kettle thinks about it for a moment, then says that while it's tempting, he'd really rather live life his own way. Kane accepts his decision. He nods and says he understands. Kettle thanks him again and promises he won't forget his kindness. As Kettle walks away, Kane watches him go quietly talking to himself. He says he was a fool to think he could ever control someone like that. It's just not possible. Kettle moves to the beat of his own drum, and while he may work with others, he doesn't answer to anyone. What goes on inside his head is a complete mystery, one that might make him even more dangerous than the average barbarian. He mulls over how absurd it all is, a being who seems like he came straight from the demon realm itself, just walking the earth as a barbarian from the White Wasteland. And now the Empire is talking about conquering the demon realm. Kane mutters that the whole idea is absolutely insane and wonders what in the world the Emperor is thinking. The scene then shifts to Luke getting a briefing. He hears the latest report and scoffs, saying that it all sounds completely ridiculous. Kane confirms that it's true. People are actually dying during these reconnaissance missions. Luke asks if he's serious. Kane nods and says he is. He wonders aloud if maybe this guy's some reborn emperor from a forgotten age. Whatever the truth is. He says it's a problem for another day. Humanity hasn't even finished taking over its own lands yet. Luke replies that it's only a matter of time. Kane agrees, but he warns that the region still technically falls under the Empire's control, and they could be called into action at any given moment. He advises him to be ready. Luke thanks him for the insight. Kane exhales slowly, saying that the world is already a complete mess, and now with the Emperor spiraling into madness, things are only getting worse. Luke suddenly looks up surprised and asks if the rumors are actually true. Kane confirms them. The demons have started to make their move. A worried expression crosses Luke's face as Kane points out that dungeon outbreaks are also popping up way more often than usual. He admits it's just a rumor, but some folks think the demon realm's influence is starting to leak into their world. Whatever the case may be, he's sure it means big trouble for everyone. Then, almost like a passing thought, he poses a question out loud. What if the threat isn't on its way, but has already arrived among them? Luke confirms the rumors are indeed true, his voice sounding more tired than confident. When Kane presses him for his opinion, Luke just admits he has no idea what to think about the whole situation. He is sure about one thing, though: Kettle isn't their enemy. But other than that, he really can't figure out where the barbarians' loyalties lie. Meanwhile, back in town, Kettle is taking a leisurely stroll, but the people around him are definitely not rolling out the welcome mat. One little kid dives behind his mom, shaking like a leaf. Another townsperson quickly ducks into a shop the second Kettle passes by. Kettle, completely baffled by this, wonders out loud if it's the way he looks that's scaring them. He glances down at his current getup, which is just a simple vest made from beast hide. He figures that while it's totally normal for a barbarian, it probably doesn't exactly scream civilized to these folks. He comes to the conclusion that they must think he's some kind of dangerous madman. He's totally wrong, of course, but his little theory is enough to make him decide on his next move. He proudly declares that it's time to get some real clothes. So he walks into a clothing store, and the shopkeeper starts to greet him before immediately jumping back in terror. Kettle cheerfully explains he's just looking to buy some clothes. The poor guy stammers an apology, insisting they don't carry anything that would fit him. Kettle just tilts his head, finding this a bit of a problem. He asks if there's really nothing at all they can do. Thinking fast, the shopkeeper suggests a custom order, if Kettle doesn't mind waiting. Kettle's face lights up at the idea, saying that would be perfect. The tailor nervously agrees, promising to get in touch with him as soon as it's finished, all while secretly praying he'll live to see tomorrow if this giant barbarian ends up hating the final outfit. A little later, on his way to the mercenary guild, something shiny on the ground catches Kettle's eye. He bends down to pick it up and finds a small, smooth bead. As he rolls it between his fingers, he can't help but wonder why a gemstone is just sitting in the middle of the street. Suddenly, it starts to give off a faint glow in his palm. Now really curious, he decides he's got to ask Rosa about it when he gets to the guild. He shows the little orb to her, explaining he just found it on his way over. Rosa examines it carefully and immediately says it's definitely not your average rock. Kettle totally agrees. She points out that it doesn't even look like a natural gem since its surface is just too perfectly smooth. It feels too intentional, like someone must have made it, but there are no markings or engravings on it whatsoever. As she keeps staring at it, her eyes start to glaze over. She begins muttering to herself, wondering if the orb could be worth something. Kettle snaps his fingers right in front of her face, and she jolts back to reality. He asks if she's okay, but she just looks confused, asking what he's talking about. He explains that for a second there, it looked like the orb had her completely mesmerized. She blinks, trying to remember what just happened, and admits that he might be onto something. She says there's a weird energy coming from it, and offers to get it officially appraised for him. But Kettle turns her down, saying that solving the mystery himself is half the fun. He then changes the subject and asks what kind of jobs they have available. Rosa, still trying to pull herself together, grabs the request sheet and shows it to him. The top job on the list: Story Street cleaning. Why, sewer cleaning, weed pulling, and potato digging. Kettle is absolutely beaming. Later that night, his little pouch of earnings sits perfectly on his nightstand. Kettle thinks back on his day, calling it another job well done. Still, that weird orb is nagging at the back of his mind. Rose's reaction was definitely not normal, and he can't help but wonder what kind of power that thing is packing. And just then, a voice suddenly rings out inside his head, telling him to come. He completely freezes, thinking, did I just hear that? The voice says it again, whispering for him to follow. Kettle scrunches up his brow, wondering where in the world it's trying to take him. He then realizes it's actually showing him something, a map right there in his head. He keeps listening, mulling it over. He glances out the window, figuring, hey, what's the harm in taking a little peek? But as the voice keeps droning on in his thoughts, he finally snaps and tells it to zip it. The scene then cuts to Kettle, standing before a spooky, dark cave. He gazes up at the entrance and cracks a small smile, asking, so is this the spot deep inside? A skeleton's eyes begin to glow in the pitch black. The voice chimes in again. Kettle calls out, all right, I'm here. Where's the person this voice belongs to? From the shadows, a sinister voice echoes back. It taunts Kettle, calling him just another idiot who's walked straight into its trap. Just one more sacrifice, though a pretty sizable one this time. The creature smirks, declaring that this makes a grand total of 10. And with that, mini resurrection might finally be on the table. And here's where we get the backstory. A long, long time ago, during the age of great wars, a super powerful and nasty mage messed with the minds of kings, pushing entire nations into conflict. He expertly manipulated the ruler's emotions, stirred up chaos, and lorded over the crumbling wreckage. But eventually, his terrible deeds came back to bite him. A group of heroes rose up and took him down, Almost right before he was toast, the mage zipped his soul into a special vessel, becoming a lich, now totally undying. And bound to his phylactery, the mage started plotting his epic comeback. He needed living sacrifices to get his strength back, so he set up shop near a forgotten region. He started planting enchanted orbs to lure in anyone clueless enough to fall for it, his ultimate goal, to collect enough lives to rebuild his mana and rise again, ready to conquer the world all over again. This region was picked specifically for its isolation. Barely anyone ever came through here, which was perfect for keeping things on the down low, but the presence of a barbarian, especially one from the White Wasteland, was highly unusual. The lich watches Kettle, clearly amused. He notes that the orb's enchantment only works on people who are clueless about the arcane arts. That means this Kettle guy must have zero magical awareness, just another pawn to help fuel his glorious rebirth. He dismisses the barbarian as just another log for the fire. Meanwhile, Kettle reaches a huge set of doors and assumes this has got to be the place. He strolls right on in and comes face to face with the lich, who's all set to chow down on his soul. Kettle's eyes go wide as he asks out loud, "Wait, is that seriously a lich?" The very idea sounds completely ridiculous. He recalls that liches are the stuff of legends. Mages who hit the absolute peak of magic and decided to ditch being mortal. They're basically the final boss in every epic fantasy story ever told. And now one of them is standing right here in front of him. The lich sneers, asking what in the world this barbarian is doing here. Wasn't he supposed to fall under the orb's spell? Kettle just laughs, putting it all together. "Oh, so that's how you've been luring in your sacrifices." The lich admits he didn't sense a single drop of arcane energy on him. He was supposed to be just your average run-of-the-mill fool. But now the lich suspects this barbarian has some kind of mental protection artifact, and a really powerful one at that, to be able to resist the orb's pull. He's completely baffled as to how a barbarian could have possibly gotten an item like that, figuring it must have been pure luck. Kettle just tells him he doesn't have any such artifact. The lich scoffs, calling him a liar and saying if he'd just given up quietly, his end could have been painless. But now he announces the barbarian will have to be crushed the hard way as he summons his undead servants. As the skeletons charge forward, Kettle just grins, remarking that stumbling into a dungeon with a real lich might be the best encounter he's had so far. The first skeleton takes a leap, and Kettle casually shatters its skull with a single swing, turning it into nothing but dust. The lich just stares in total disbelief. Kettle notes that the skeletons are pretty flimsy, way weaker than he was expecting. The lich scowls, threatening to rip his limbs off and keep him just barely alive for the ritual. He summons 12 more skeletons and orders them to cut Kettle down. Kettle just lets out a sigh and cracks his knuckles. As they swarm him, he launches one into the air, smashes another into the ground, and slams a third with a high kick, before plowing through the rest with raw strength. The lich is frozen solid, totally speechless. Kettle casually mentions that just like Sen once told him, destroying the head works just fine, but he's still disappointed for a lich. No Death Knight, no necrotic horrors, not even a summoned abomination, just skeletons. The lich Cardos is absolutely seething with frustration, muttering that he's done playing nice. His staff begins to pulse with a fierce, unnatural glow, and the whole cavern trembles as he calls forth something much stronger, something meant to end this foolishness for good. From the shadows, a heavily armored skeleton knight emerges, summoned by Cardos himself. Kettle's eyes widen slightly in recognition. He says it's been a while since he's seen one of these, but considering it was conjured up by a lich, he figures it might actually be a little more dangerous and interesting this time. Cardos points a bony hand toward the knight and commands it to kill. The undead champion surges forward without hesitation, its sword drawn, its eyes glowing with magical fire. Kettle tightens his stance, muttering that a skeleton knight made by a lich ought to be different, much stronger. As the knight approaches, it lifts its weapon for a massive cleaving strike, but Kettle moves first, driving his fist straight through its torso. The blow sends the knight crashing into the far wall with enough force to make its armor explode into fragments on impact. A cloud of dust swirls, and from the rubble, the skeleton knight drags itself back out, crawling along the floor. Kettle, watching this, admits that it's definitely tougher than the others. The lich, seeing his creation is damaged but still moving, unleashes the knight's full mana reserves. Arcane power explodes around it, and the knight launches itself forward again, now moving faster and looking deadlier than before. Kettle simply stands his ground as it charges. He narrows his eyes, unimpressed, and remarks that this is a bit underwhelming for something a lich created. He steps into the attack and smashes the knight in the head, sending it flying backward once more in another thunderous explosion. Cardos waits, staring into the dust, looking for any movement, but this time the knight doesn't get up. Kettle casually steps on its outstretched hand and declares that while it was unusual, it wasn't anything special in the end. He then asks the lich if that was all he had to offer. Cardo stares completely stunned. He says he still can't sense any arcane power from Kettle, no magic signature, and no protective artifact. Not even a trace of leftover mana, which means Kettle just took out a fully powered skeleton knight using nothing but pure raw strength. The lich is stunned, admitting he didn't even think something like that was possible, and realizing Kettle must be a completely different kind of beast. Then with a ton of dramatic flair, Cardos raises his staff and declares he's going to handle this personally. The whole cavern starts to go dark with shadows creeping in until the only thing you can see is the spooky red glow of Cardos' eyes. Kettle, totally loving the new vibe, just grins and asks if this means the real fun is finally about to start. The lich threatens that Kettle will pay dearly for waltzing into his sacred space, but Kettle just shrugs. He casually mentions that he only came because the orb led him there and just assumed Cardos was the one behind it all. The lich confirms he was. Turns out those orbs were his little traps scattered across the land to lure in sacrifices. Kettle, like all the others, had simply fallen for the bait. Cardos raises his staff even higher, puffing out his chest, as he proclaims his grand title, the mighty sorcerer who brought down 5 entire kingdoms. He boasts about fighting legendary heroes and ruling with an iron fist before finally announcing his full ridiculously long name, Cardos Brenus Kessis. Kettle just blinks completely unfazed and wonders out loud why everyone in this world has such long, dramatic names. Ignoring him completely, Cardos casts his signature spell. The air itself starts to twist and warp as a strange energy swirls from his staff right at Kettle. And this isn't just any old attack. It's a psychological curse, a spell specifically designed to mess with your deepest emotions and bring all your inner darkness to the surface. It's meant to trap victims inside their own heads, leaving them mentally paralyzed. This is Cardos' classic move. He's spent centuries perfecting it, so it uses almost 0 mana, but can break nearly any mind it touches. Cardos starts to laugh, gloating that a simple barbarian with no magic resistance doesn't stand a chance. His plan is to capture Kettle for a bit of research. The skeleton guards get back up and Cardos orders them to grab the barbarian. But as the bony crew moves in, Kettle just steps forward, his eyes perfectly clear. Without a moment's hesitation, he punts one of the skeletons, which shatters into a cloud of dust. Cardos just stares his jaw on the floor as another skeleton explodes. He mutters that the spell should have worked without a hitch. Kettle turns to him and asks, "Seriously, you thought that weak little trick would trap me, and are you really sending more skeletons at me again?" He adds that it's honestly getting pretty boring. At this point, Cardos is starting to get desperate. He insists that all humans are driven by their emotions, that even the strongest ones are haunted by some inner demons. But this guy, this barbarian, shouldn't be immune. And yet he clearly is. Cardos watches in disbelief as Kettle casually strolls through more skeletons, taking them apart with no effort at all. Then Kettle asks if he knows how to cast something a little more exciting, maybe like a fireball. The lich absolutely bristles with rage. He screams that comparing his ultimate spells to basic magic is a grave insult, but if that's what Kettle wants, then he's going to get something even bigger. Cardos begins a deep, ominous chant, summoning some dark creature inside a glowing orb. He dramatically announces that this spell will plunge the world into chaos and destroy clarity itself. Kettle just watches with a look of genuine admiration as the spell comes together. When Cardos finally unleashes it, the energy roars out and completely engulfs Kettle. The lich lets out a howl of victory, but his celebration is cut short when his knees buckle. He collapses and starts coughing violently, spitting up some nasty black gunk. He mutters that he used up everything his entire mana pool except for the tiny bit needed to keep his physical body from crumbling to dust. Still, he figures it was all worth it. The barbarian must be totally finished by now. But then Kettle's voice cuts through the silence. He calls the spell impressive, then casually asks if that's all he's got. Cardos just stares his eyes wide in disbelief as Kettle walks out of the swirling darkness completely unharmed. Kettle says he honestly didn't feel a thing, and if that was Cardos' big grand finale, then maybe it's his turn now. He coolly lifts his axe onto his shoulder, looking totally confident. Cardos suddenly bursts into manic laughter, declaring that it all makes sense now. Kettle must have known who he was from the very start. He's convinced the Empire sent him since only they would go to such great lengths to hunt him down. He even praises their intelligence network for tracking him down so quickly, but he vows that he will rise again and rule once more. He then mentions that he's heard some interesting rumors. Apparently, deep within the Empire, there's a secret facility that engineers elite warriors, each one created for a very specific purpose. He declares that Kettle must be one of them, a living weapon forged just to kill him. Kardos shrieks that, even so, he will defy fate. He's going to destroy the Empire, burn its armies to the ground, and reclaim his throne of darkness. And with that, the final act gets underway. Kardos summons a spiritual artifact, a ghostly-looking vase. It glows with an ominous light as he hurls it right at Kettle, revealing that it's actually his own soul. This is his final desperate move. Kardos plans to possess Kettle's body and devour his mind from the inside. Without being able to become a lich again, this move would trap him inside Kettle's body forever, but he's all out of options. His soul flies into Kettle as he proclaims that the barbarian's body now belongs to him. Kettle pauses for a moment, and then everything goes completely still. Kardos' soul has made it inside. The possession is starting, but something feels off. Something is definitely not right, and Kardos now inside Kettle's mind is about to realize just how massive of a mistake he's just made. Kardos starts laughing triumphantly, shouting that the body is his, but deep within the recesses of Kettle's mind, something is horribly, terribly wrong. Kardos, now inside the barbarian's mental world, just stumbles around in a state of utter confusion. He mutters that he's never seen anything like it. Everything is warped, disjointed, hostile, and completely unnatural. The simple act of trying to perceive Kettle's inner world begins to shatter Kardos' consciousness. He insists this can't possibly be something the Empire created. This is way beyond them. Panic starts to kick in as his thoughts begin to unravel. His mind starts to splinter from the overwhelming pressure, and he cries out in disbelief, stammering incoherently before his consciousness just collapses into nothing. His very last words are little more than a confused, defeated, "Huh." Kettle, watching Kardos' body slump to the floor, just raises an eyebrow and says he has no idea what in the world just happened. The lich seemed to cast some spell on himself and then just completely fell apart. He admits that swirling black magic looked pretty neat for a second, but other than that, it was really underwhelming. He remarks that if leashes are supposed to be the peak of magic, this one certainly didn't live up to all the hype. He lets out a sigh of disappointment, saying that the liches in this world must not be all that impressive. Still, the dungeon is cleared. So now it's time to claim his prize. He picks up Kardos' staff, noticing how it glowed whenever he was casting spells. He wonders if it's a magic boosting item, and if that means he could maybe try casting some spells too. Just then, he spots a glowing crystal. Figuring it might be worth something, he snags it and takes another look around. He scoops up the strange vase that was attached to Kardos. Considering how important it seemed to be and how obsessed Kardos was with it, he figures it's probably a phylactery. He makes a mental note to have Rosa appraise it later. With that decided, he starts gathering up the rest of the sweet, sweet loot. But hold on, something doesn't quite feel right. His eyes scan the cave and lock onto a suspicious-looking patch of wall. Intrigued, he wanders over and gives it a little poke. Just like that, the wall crumbles away, revealing a secret passage. He steps on through, and immediately the air gets a whole lot colder. Inside the hidden chamber, dozens of people are lined up against the walls. They're completely motionless and silent, their eyes just vacant. Kettle blinks a little, taken aback by the creepy scene. He mutters to himself that this must have been some kind of sacrificial chamber. He walks past the lifeless figures, waving a hand in front of their faces to check for a reaction. He even gets right up close to see if they'd flinch. Nothing. He lets out a sigh and figures it's best to just report this. There's really nothing more he can do for them here, so he leaves the dungeon and heads straight for the guild. When he walks into the guild hall, Rosa greets him with a super bright smile, surprised to see him back so early in the day. He just says he had a few things to take care of. She asks him what sort of things, and Kettle casually reminds her about that orb he showed her just the day before. And then he just launches into the whole wild story. At first, Rosa just laughs, thinking he's pulling her leg, a lich out here, but Kettle insists it's the real deal. Her smile completely vanishes when he pulls out the vase, explaining that it might be the life vessel and asking her to take a look at it. She stares at the artifact for a hot second, then physically recoils in shock. Her voice is all shaky as she finally realizes he is 100% serious. Still trying to process everything she's hearing, Rosa starts to stammer, while Kettle calmly adds that there were also a bunch of people trapped inside the dungeon. He mentions that he thought about bringing them out, but their minds were totally gone, so he decided to leave them where they were. He says it would probably be for the best if the guild sent someone to investigate. That's when it clicks for Rosa. who remembers hearing about several recent disappearances around the territory. All those cases had gone cold, with no resolution. But now with this new info, it's all starting to make a terrifying amount of sense. She tells him to wait right there and rushes off to grab someone. A few moments later, the guard captain bursts into the hall, his eyes wide with panic. He's practically shouting, asking if it's true that a lich was here. Kettle just gives him a friendly greeting and assures him that everything's already been handled. There's nothing to worry about, he says. The captain just stares at him completely confused and asks what he means. But when Kettle mentions the name Cardos, the captain's face turns ghost white. He shouts that of course he knows that name. Cardos was a world-shakingly powerful sorcerer. He was the guy who invented magic that could manipulate human emotions, a complete madman who threw 5 kingdoms into a massive war by driving their kings insane. The captain can hardly believe that a figure like that was hiding out here as a lich. He asks again, his voice trembling, "Is this really true?" Kettle just confirms it. "Yep," he says. "Cardos was there, but honestly, he wasn't very impressive. He mostly just talked to himself. He did some weird magic, and then he just kind of self-destructed." The captain starts blinking rapidly, demanding a better explanation. "You know something that actually makes sense." Kettle simply shrugs and says that's pretty much what happened, still totally baffled. The guard captain tells him to wait there while he goes to inform the Lord. Over at the estate, Luke slams both of his hands on a table. He's yelling in pure disbelief. "A lich, right on our doorstep." He demands confirmation, asking if it's possible it was a different kind of monster. The guard captain reports that based on the witness statements and the fact that they have the phylactery, there's very little room for doubt. Luke just mutters the word, completely stunned. A lich of that caliber hiding out so close by means the Empire might send investigators at any second. And with Kane gone, you just know the timing couldn't possibly be worse. Luke sighs, ordering the capital to get ready, and figures that all things considered, they might have actually gotten lucky. And the guard captain totally agrees. I mean, if Kettle hadn't stumbled upon that place, they would have been the first successful sacrifices on Cardos' comeback tour. It seems the lich was in the home stretch of his big resurrection ritual. Luke gives a grim nod, admitting it's very possible they just sidestepped a major catastrophe. He adds that what Kettle did was above and beyond, and they absolutely have to reward him for it properly. Of course, whether they can actually afford a worthy reward is another question entirely. Flash forward to the next morning at the estate, and some super loud knocking is echoing through the halls. A still sleepy Luke wakes up, but he immediately perks up when he hears a visitor has arrived. The doors swing open dramatically, and a servant announces the arrival of the Inquisitor of the Sun God Lord Aquas. Luke is completely floored. A woman steps into the estate with an air of quiet authority, and he's just thinking, what is someone like her doing here? Why is the Inquisition at my front door? He quickly ushers her into the guest room, where they sit across from each other. He introduces himself with all the formal bells and whistles her station requires and thanks her for coming, even though the visit was a total surprise. Aquas just sits there in silence for a beat before speaking. She introduces herself as an Inquisitor of the Sun God, and not just any Inquisitor, she's the youngest person to ever hold the title. She's also the woman famous for executing 7 warlocks who made deals with demons, and the one-woman army who shut down a ritual meant to open a gateway to another realm. This is no ordinary envoy. She's considered the most powerful Inquisitor on the whole continent. Even the Empire knows not to mess with the Church of the Sun God, a fact Luke is very much aware of. Her power totally eclipses his authority as a provincial lord, so you can bet he's hanging on her every word, trying to figure out why such a big shot is gracing his home. She finally says she's heard some rumors, that the estate has been a little noisy lately. Luke plays it cool, informing Aquas that there was just a minor disturbance with a nearby dungeon, but he assures her the whole situation is already handled. Assuming her visit has nothing to do with the lich incident, he asks her what brings her here. Aquas calmly replies that she's here about a divine oracle. That definitely catches Luke off guard, but before she reveals what the oracle said, she insists on hearing everything that's been going on lately. Luke thinks it over for a second, then decides to just be straight with her. She then asks if it's true, that a barbarian took down the lich. Luke confirms it, and then drops another bombshell the lich might have been the one and only Cardos. Aquas raises an eyebrow, looking genuinely shaken by the idea. She says that sounds completely insane and asks if he has any proof. Luke retrieves the phylactery and places it right in front of her. The moment she sees it, her cool composure completely cracks. She grips her amulet tightly and asks if the barbarian is still on the estate. Luke replies that he's still within their borders. Aqua's mutters under her breath that this just shouldn't be possible. Then Luke goes on to explain that this barbarian even defeated Lord Cain. Aquas takes a deep breath, saying that this confirms everything. A new power has emerged. She then asks what tribe he belongs to. Luke tells her the barbarian claims to be from the White Wastelands, which seems to stun her even more. She remarks that something born in the demon-infested north shouldn't be able to leave so easily. Then a glint of realization flashes in her eyes. She starts wondering out loud if maybe, just maybe, this barbarian guy is the whole reason she got her divine calling in the first place. Luke, leaning in a bit, asks her what she's getting at, but Aqua just says she'd rather talk to the barbarian face to face. Meanwhile, over at his inn, Kettle's busy squinting at some weird magical stone, trying to figure out what in the world it's supposed to do. He figures it's some kind of support artifact, probably the kind of thing mages use. He makes a quick mental note to ask a real magic user about it later, and then it hits him the appointment. You see, earlier that morning, the guard captain had let him know that the Sun God's Inquisitor wanted to have a chat, and that it was all going down at the local church. The captain had also a little nervously asked Kettle to maybe, show some proper respect during the meeting. Kettle, being his usual laid-back self, just told him not to sweat it. Soon enough, the guard captain shows up. He glances around the room and asks if Kettle's ready to go. Seeing him already decked out in clean clothes, the captain figures that's a yes, so they head out together. As they're walking, Kettle starts thinking about how this world works. Here, gods aren't just some vague myths you read about. They're the real deal. They hand out power directly. They even show up in person, and the spots where their chosen followers hang out, yep, those are the churches. Now, that, he thinks to himself, is what makes a fantasy church so different. Right on cue, they arrive at a massive cathedral. Its spires are just gleaming in the sun. Kettle is obviously impressed, saying it looks incredible. The guard captain tells him someone will show him the way once he's inside. Kettle gives him a quick thanks and steps right on through the doors. Inside, the whole hall is bathed in warm golden light streaming through these enormous stained glass windows, and the faint scent of incense hangs in the air. A couple of sisters come up and greet him very politely, letting him know the Inquisitor is waiting. They offer to lead him to the private chamber. Kettle's all for it and agrees right away. Once inside the meeting room, Aqua stands up to greet him. She introduces herself with all this formal flair, and Kettle plays along, matching her tone. He can't help but notice how young she is and gives her a compliment on her obviously impressive skills. And he gives her a little smile. Aqua catches it, pauses for a second, and asks him what's so funny. Kettle just straight up asks why she wanted to see him, a question that seems to throw her for a loop for a moment. She looks down for a second and says it's about what's been happening lately. She starts to lay out everything she knows about Cardos the sorcerer who did all those terrible, unspeakable things. How he manipulated rulers, wrecked entire kingdoms, and eventually cheated death to become a lich. She explains that only a legendary hero would stand a chance against a monster like that. Kettle just nods and says, "Yeah, I've heard the stories." But what he saw was a lich basically flailing around like a weirdo, muttering to himself, and then just poof, he imploded. He adds that he gets it if she finds that a little hard to swallow, but he can only tell her what he saw with his own 2 eyes. Aqua gives him a serious look and asks if he'd be willing to let her god listen in on their conversation. Kettle raises an eyebrow, asking her to explain. She tells him that if he lies while the sun god is watching, there'll be a divine reaction. It's basically a holy lie detector test. She adds that even if he isn't your average barbarian, he's still a barbarian at the end of the day, and she seriously doubts he'd agree to be put under that kind of microscope. But Kettle just shrugs it off and says he doesn't have a reason to say no. In fact, he's actually excited for the chance to see some divine power up close and personal. Aqua just stares at him a bit, taken aback by how eager he is, and asks if he's really okay with this. Kettle just shrugs, saying he's got nothing to hide. He points out that he hasn't told any lies, and if a god wants to eavesdrop, then let him listen. That's when she realizes she might have gotten him all wrong, and her expression softens just a little. She nods, saying she understands and that they can start. She clasps her hands together, bows her head, and begins to pray, calling for her god's attention. She calls out to the one who rules from on high, the divine eye, watching from the heavens, asking him to expose any untruths in the room. All of a sudden, a massive pillar of golden light blasts down into the chamber. You can feel the temperature change, and the air gets heavy. Kettle looks up completely in awe and says out loud that he can feel something past the light. It's just massive, a presence so huge you can't even describe it with words. But the thing that really gets him is the emotion he feels from it. Confusion, pure divine confusion. Aqua slowly opens her eyes and says she's relieved. There wasn't any kind of divine backlash. The pillar of light remains perfectly calm. She explains that from now on, no one can tell a lie within its glow. Kettle just grins and says he gets it loud and clear. And so, right after that incredible display of the sun, God's power, the questioning between Kettle and Inquisitor Aqua officially started. Kettle walked her through the entire dungeon raid right up to his showdown with the lich. And as he told his story, the holy light all around them stayed perfectly calm and steady, proving that every single word he said was the absolute truth. Inside her head, Aqua figured that the lich Cardos must have been super weak while he was getting his resurrection ritual ready. She came to the conclusion that Kettle only survived because of his own strength and a whole lot of dumb luck. Because if Cardos had been at 100%, this barbarian definitely wouldn't be standing here right now. Once the divine truth check was over, Kettle asked if she was finally convinced. She admitted she was, and even apologized for doubting him earlier. But he just waved it off, saying there was no need to apologize since he actually found the whole thing pretty interesting himself. After a short pause, Aqua asked if she could ask him one last personal question. When he gave her the go-ahead, she hesitated for a second before asking in a voice that was both firm and a little shaky if he was really from the white snowfield. Kettle calmly replied that he was. Hearing that Aqua's composure completely crumbled, she just couldn't wrap her head around how anyone could come out of that demonic wasteland alive. Her mind instantly jumped to the ancient legend of the Ashen Barbarian, a story the Emperor himself once told. Her expression suddenly sharpened, and her crimson eyes narrowed with curiosity when Kettle announced he had a question for her too. He asked her why she decided to come to this territory of all places. Aqua replied that she was just there on some personal business, but Kettle's stare got real intense as he suggested her real reason was to see if he was some kind of unclean being. Startled, she tried to deny it, but Kettle cut her off, clarifying that he was talking about the Eye of God, pointing out that the divine presence watching them was way more powerful than some simple lie detection spell. Trapped by the sun god's power, which made lying impossible, Aqua had no choice but to admit that his deduction was true. And from her admission, Kettle suddenly got the feeling that he might have been her real target the whole time, but she was quick to deny that little theory. She explained that she only started to get a hunch about who he was after she got to the area thinking he might be the guy from the prophecy. But as it turned out, a divine revelation told her that wasn't the case. She apologized for hiding her true intentions, and Kettle, holding no grudge, totally accepted it. He actually said the whole situation was pretty fascinating, so he jumped at the chance to ask her about that prophecy she'd brought up. Aqua hesitated for a second, her hand tightening around the sun-shaped pendant at her neck. She admitted that the prophecy was a secret she usually only shared with people she trusted with her life. Still, she decided to tell him everything. She began to recount the details, her voice steady but serious. All the while, Kettle's face slowly filled with pure astonishment as he listened. Afterward, time seemed to stand still. Aqua stood by the church's massive window, completely lost in thought until the sound of footsteps snapped her back to reality. Turning around, she saw Lord Barhan entering the hall. He immediately noticed the troubled look on her face and asked what was bothering her. She replied that she had just met someone, a person whose very presence had tangled up her thoughts even more. When he pressed her for a name, she stated firmly that the man was indeed a barbarian from the White Snowfield. Lord Barhan reacted with complete disbelief. He asked if she was absolutely certain. Aqua confirmed it in a heartbeat, adding that if news like this ever got out, the entire world would be thrown into absolute chaos. The Lord sighed, a heavy weight in his chest. He complained that the one thing he was hoping was just a rumor had turned out to be the real deal. He voiced his concern that if the Emperor heard about this, he would for sure try to march into the White Snowfield himself, and the results would be a total catastrophe. Aqua reassured him that her order planned on handling the Lich Cardo situation personally, and they'd make sure the barbarian's existence stayed a secret from everyone. Her words seemed to put the Lord's worries at ease. He then asked if all the barbarians from that frozen land were as monstrously strong as Kettle. Aqua replied that they weren't, not by a long shot. She explained that if every one of them had that kind of power, they would have stormed down from the snowfield to take over the world a long time ago. The Lord agreed, remarking that while barbarians were definitely physical powerhouses, their lack of smarts was the natural handicap that kept them in check. And yet he quietly admitted his fear of what might happen if beings like that ever combined all that raw power with actual intelligence. Aqua told him that from what she'd gathered, Kettle had both. She also mentioned that the current king of the barbarians was very different from the ones before him. When asked if she'd ever met him, she confessed that she had and confirmed he was truly in a league of his own compared to the others. The Lord remarked that a meeting between Kettle and this king would be quite a sight to see. But Aqua immediately shut that idea down flat. He looked taken aback by her sudden reaction, which led her to explain that relations between barbarians and followers of the gods were incredibly tense, and that the barbarians' growing influence was nothing to scoff at. The Lord then decided to switch gears back to the original topic. He asked about the prophecy that had made her request a private meeting with Kettle. She explained that she needed to confirm something vital. When the Lord asked what it was, she answered that she had to find out if Kettle was 100% human or just something disguised as one. A look of pure shock washed over the Lord's face as he demanded to know what the prophecy said. Aqua moved towards the grand towering window, becoming bathed in the golden light streaming through the glass, and finally shared the prophecy's words. After her voice faded, the Lord just stood there frozen, his eyes wide as he whispered in utter disbelief at what he'd just heard. Sometime later, Lord Barkin called for Kettle once again. Kettle mentioned that thanks to the Lord's recent help, everything in the territory was running like a well-oiled machine. He then asked why he had been summoned again. The Lord replied that he had something he needed to share with him, something that was his duty to say as the ruler of the land. Kettle, however, looked only mildly interested. The Lord continued anyway, explaining that he'd prepared a reward to thank Kettle for his role in saving the territory. At his signal, a guard walked into the chamber with a small leather pouch and placed it right in front of Kettle. Kettle raised an eyebrow, surprised by the rather humble-looking gift. The Lord explained that this was no ordinary pouch, telling him he should check it out for himself. Kettle picked it up, turning it over in his hands, and he could already feel that something about it was special. The Lord told him to open it, revealing it was a magical artifact, a bag-type relic to be specific. He explained that it could hold a massive number of items, as many as its internal space would allow. He added that the space inside was about as big as the very hall they were standing in. Kettle was absolutely floored. This was the very first time he had ever seen a genuine magic-crafted artifact with his own two eyes. The Lord also mentioned that the bag could store things much larger than its opening, encouraging him to give it a try. Excited Kettle decided to test it out with his massive axe. He held the huge weapon over the tiny opening, looking pretty skeptical that it would fit. The very moment the axe touched the rim, it was sucked right inside with a flash of light and vanished completely. The astonishment on Kettle's face was plain to see. The Lord explained